Samantha Shelley Nance was born in 1989 in a small town in Italy, Texas, into a loving and close-knit family. Her parents, Linda and John, always tried to surround their daughter with care and support, striving to give her the best education and the opportunity to develop her talents. Linda worked as a music teacher at a local school. She was a person with a delicate soul and a special warmth. John, an engineer by profession, was known for his practical thinking and strong character. Together, they created a cozy and stable atmosphere at home, where Samantha could feel protected and loved. From an early age, Samantha showed an unusual interest in art. Even in elementary school, her drawings stood out from those of her classmates. She was skilled with a pencil and brush and knew how to convey emotions and fine details on paper. Her parents often noticed how she could sit in her room for hours, immersed in her creativity, dreaming of one day becoming a famous artist. Those around her described her as a cheerful and open girl with an easygoing personality and a thirst for adventure. When it came time to choose a career, Samantha did not hesitate to enroll in an art school in Dallas, where she could deepen her knowledge and skills. Moving to the big city gave her the opportunity to turn a new page in her life. Independence, new friends, opportunities for growth. At art college, Samantha quickly became one of the most notable students, not only because of her talent, but also because of her friendly and sincere personality. She participated in exhibitions, student projects, and actively socialized with her peers. At college, Samantha met Nathan Shack, a young man who eventually became not only her boyfriend, but also a close friend. Nathan was a few years older, a student in the music production department, and a quiet and calm person. He was interested in music and sound engineering and dreamed of a career in the entertainment industry. According to their mutual acquaintances, Nathan was a reliable person. Although somewhat shy and reserved, he quickly attracted Samantha's attention with his kindness and sincerity. Their relationship developed gradually. At first, they were just friends, going to classes and student events together. Later, their connection became more romantic. They spent evenings talking, walking in parks and city streets, sharing their dreams and plans for the future. Their friends called them an awkwardly cute couple. Both were a little shy and sometimes insecure, but that only made their relationship more endearing. Samantha's parents were happy that their daughter had found support and stability in Nathan. They saw him as a decent and reliable young man who sincerely loved their daughter. However, beneath the outward calm of their relationship, the first signs of tension were beginning to show. Samantha began to think more and more about the future, including whether she should continue her relationship with Nathan. She shared with her loved ones that she sometimes felt restricted in the relationship, but tried not to dwell on it so as not to worry her parents. September 19, 2009 was the start of a new school year that promised to be an important milestone in the young woman's life. September 11, like many other days, began quietly. Linda and John, as usual, tried to contact their daughter to find out how her day had gone, but this time the phone was silent. Samantha did not answer her calls or messages, which was unusual and caused her parents to worry. They called several times and tried to text her, but to no avail. At first, the couple thought that their daughter might have simply forgotten her phone or been busy with her studies. But as time passed, their concern grew. Linda and John tried to contact the art school, where they were told that Samantha had not attended classes that day and had not been in touch with her teachers. This information only heightened their anxiety. Not knowing what to do next, the parents called Ashley Olver, Samantha's neighbor and best friend, with whom she shared an apartment. Ashley was out when the call came in, but she immediately agreed to check if everything was okay. Samantha usually came home in the evening, and her delay was unusual. As she approached the apartment, Ashley still hoped that her friend had simply been delayed or was somewhere safe. However, when she opened the door, she was met with a scene that would remain etched in her memory forever. Samantha was lying on the bed, lifeless and covered in blood. The scene shocked Ashley. She immediately realized that a tragedy had occurred. Without wasting any time, she called the police. Those moments marked the beginning of a long and painful investigation that soon shook not only Samantha's loved ones, but also the entire college community and the city. It seemed impossible that such a cheerful, talented, and hopeful girl could have been the victim of such a horrific crime. Parents, friends, and teachers tried to understand how this tragedy could have happened and who could have been involved. Early that evening, as dusk began to fall on the streets of Dallas, the police received an alarming call from Ashley Olvera, Samantha Nance's neighbor and friend. The message was short but chilling. "Please come quickly. I found Samantha. She's not okay." Dispatchers immediately sent several crews to the apartment complex where the young artist lived. Upon arriving at the scene, officers immediately began searching the apartment. The hallway was narrow, and the walls were decorated with Samantha's artwork. Bright, emotional paintings that stood in stark contrast to what lay ahead. The first thing that caught their eye was the mess. The hallway was littered with scattered items, several books, clothes strewn about, a broken vase with shards of ceramic lying by the door. The officers exchanged glances. This was clearly not accidental disorder, but rather the result of a struggle. Heading toward the bedroom, the police noticed bloodstains on the floor, which gradually became more abundant. The traces led to Samantha's room. The door was open, and the moment the officers entered, a horrific scene unfolded before them. The body of a young woman lay on the bed. It was Samantha. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, her body covered in bloodstains. There were bloodstains on the sheets and pillows, as if her last moments had been spent fighting for breath. Medical experts who arrived at the scene immediately determined that the woman had suffered multiple stab wounds, mainly to her back and neck. According to preliminary estimates, there were 42 wounds, each penetrating deep into the tissue, indicating the ferocity and cruelty of the perpetrator. The wounds were of various types. Some were cuts, others were stab wounds, indicating the use of a sharp and thin object, possibly a knife or blade. The police carefully examined the room, trying to preserve every detail. A broken cell phone lay on the floor near the bed. The screen was cracked and covered with a network of fine cracks. Despite the damage, forensic experts were able to retrieve messages from the phone's memory that caused particular concern. They contained threats from an unknown sender, insistently demanding that she stop communicating with someone or threatening violence. The content of these messages posed a serious danger and led investigators to believe that Samantha may have been in danger long before the tragic incident. Police officers began to carefully record all the evidence, photographing every inch of the room. Fingerprints, bloodstains, and personal belongings were sent to the lab for detailed analysis. The apartment was sealed off to prevent any contamination of the crime scene. Shortly after the inspection, the collection of witness statements began. They decided to interview Samantha's relatives and friends first to understand her circle of acquaintances and possible motives. Samantha's parents, Linda and John, were in a state of shock, barely able to believe what had happened. They struggled to talk about their daughter, recalling her bright personality, her love of art, and her dreams for the future. The investigators paid particular attention to Samantha's boyfriend, Nathan Shaku. According to her parents and friends, he was her boyfriend, and their relationship had become very important over the past year. He was called in for questioning to understand his role in the girl's life and to find out about any possible conflicts. The database showed that Nathan had no criminal record and was a calm and responsible person. However, the investigation did not rule out the possibility that there could have been problems in his personal relationships, which sometimes lead to tragedy. Samantha's friend and neighbor, Ashley Olvera, gave important testimony. She said that Samantha had recently seemed troubled, sometimes talking about relationship difficulties and receiving strange, threatening messages, but did not want to worry her parents and was trying to cope on her own. Ashley described her as strong but withdrawn, trying to hide her problems, which made it difficult to identify the danger in time. The police began analyzing phone calls and messages to track down who could be behind the threats. They also began examining surveillance cameras located near the house and on nearby streets in search of suspicious individuals who may have visited Samantha's apartment that day. Among the interesting details, investigators noted that the apartment showed no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were closed and the locks were undamaged. This suggested that Samantha either let the perpetrator in herself or that he had a key to the apartment. This fact narrowed the circle of suspects to people from the girl's immediate circle. The atmosphere at the scene was tense. Investigators and forensic experts exchanged assumptions and discussed different versions of how events might have unfolded. Each of them understood that they were dealing with a complex and high-profile case where every scrap of information would be needed to piece together the picture of the tragedy. One of the officers, a young detective named Thomas, who was responding to his first crime scene that evening, later recalled, "When we entered the room, there was a feeling of complete devastation. You see life leaving a person, and you realize that you have a difficult job ahead of you, not just finding the killer, but explaining why this happened." Meanwhile, the investigation delved deeper into Samantha's life. It turned out that she was not only a talented student, but also an active member of the student community, respected and liked by everyone. But even in her circle, there were moments of tension, unresolved conflicts, and secrets that the investigators intended to uncover. By evening, the police had already compiled a preliminary list of witnesses: teachers, classmates, friends, and co-workers. All of them were to give statements that could shed light on the last days and hours of Samantha's life. The collected materials, photos from the crime scene, threatening messages, and witness statements, became the basis for further investigation. The investigators were determined to find the culprit and bring at least a small measure of justice to the Nance family. After a thorough examination of the crime scene and the collection of evidence, the police began questioning a key witness and close friend of Samantha Nance, Nathan Shack. The young man, who was grieving the loss of his girlfriend, was called to the police station that same evening to clarify the details of his relationship with Samantha and find out what could have led to the tragedy. Nathan arrived at the interrogation in a depressed state. His face expressed deep sadness and sincere regret, and his voice betrayed his grief. The police immediately noted that he seemed sincere. It is difficult to pretend in such situations, and his words revealed his true feelings. However, the investigators were forced to maintain professional distance and consider everything solely from the point of view of the facts. During the conversation, Nathan told them about his relationship with Samantha. Their relationship had begun about a year ago and had developed quite harmoniously, but in recent months difficulties had arisen. Samantha seemed increasingly pensive and distracted, sometimes avoiding communication, and also expressed doubts about the future of their relationship. He noted that she mentioned wanting to rethink or even end the relationship, but did not give any direct reasons. Data extracted from Samantha's phone confirmed Nathan's words. In her correspondence and draft messages, there were attempts by the girl to prepare for a conversation about breaking up. The texts indicated that she did not want to cause pain and hoped that everything would pass peacefully. This information led investigators to seriously consider the possibility that the murder was motivated by a breakup or emotional conflict. However, during the investigation, it was discovered that Nathan had a solid alibi for the time of the alleged murder. He was visiting a friend, which was confirmed by several witnesses. In addition, his behavior and words did not arouse the investigators' suspicions. Moreover, he showed genuine grief and regret over Samantha's death, which confused the evidence, as his motive for murder seemed weak. Despite this, Nathan provided valuable information. He told investigators about his roommate, 26-year-old Daniel William, a former Marine baker who in his opinion had a negative attitude towards Samantha and had repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction with their relationship. Nathan noted that Daniel had shown signs of jealousy and even aggression toward the girl, although he had never directly threatened her. This information drew the police's attention to a new suspect. The decision to search the room shared by Nathan and Daniel was made without delay. Forensic experts examined the premises, and evidence confirming the suspicions soon began to emerge. One of the key and significant findings in the investigation was a plastic bag found in Samantha Nance's bathroom. The bag was sealed, but there were bloodstains visible on its surface. Forensic investigators immediately took samples from the bag and sent them for DNA analysis. The results confirmed that the blood belonged to Samantha. This discovery was significant for the case, as it indicated that the perpetrator had attempted to hide or destroy evidence related to the crime. The presence of a blood-stained bag in the bathroom suggested that the killer had not only committed a brutal act, but had also tried to cover his tracks. The bag with blood could have been used to transport or temporarily store contaminated items such as clothing or tools that could have been used as evidence. Such caution suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with the apartment and had free access to the victim's personal space, which ruled out the possibility of a random attack by a stranger. In addition, the fact that the bag was found in the bathroom indicated that the perpetrator had attempted to remove bloodstains in a room where hygiene cleaning usually takes place. This further strengthened the suspicion that the perpetrator had tried to cover up the traces after the crime, showing a certain degree of composure and preparedness. Thus, this blood-stained bag became one of the most important pieces of evidence that narrowed down the circle of suspects and put the investigation on the right track. During a detailed examination of the room shared by Nathan Shack and Daniel William, forensic experts paid particular attention to the suspect's wardrobe. Among Daniel's belongings, they found clothes with clear bloodstains. Experts took samples from these stains and sent them for laboratory analysis, the results of which were unequivocal. The blood belonged to Samantha Nance, who had died in that very apartment. The discovery of the victim's blood on the suspect's clothing was serious evidence of his involvement in the crime. Such evidence could not have appeared by accident. It indicated that Daniel had been in close contact with Samantha at the moment she was injured or killed. Moreover, the bloodstains indicated attempts to cover up the traces. The clothes had been hidden in a closet, which suggests deliberate actions to conceal evidence. This discovery significantly strengthened the suspicions against Daniel and was one of the decisive factors that prompted the police to call him in for questioning. The investigators understood that they were now dealing with a man who had strong motives for being responsible for what had happened. In addition, officers found remnants of blue material near the crime scene, fragments of gloves that did not belong to Samantha. This detail caught the attention of experts, as such small items often become key pieces of evidence in criminal investigations. Investigators obtained surveillance camera footage that recorded movements in the area on the day of the murder. The video showed a man resembling Daniel in one of the Walmart stores. There, he bought gloves, hair dye, and soap items that could be used to cover up traces of the crime. These images became important evidence in the case, pointing to the suspect's premeditated action. The police began a thorough investigation into Daniel's background. It is known that he served in the Navy and had experience as a baker, which made him disciplined and focused, but his relationship with Samantha and Nathan was tense. Neighbors and acquaintances noted that he was withdrawn and often irritable, especially in situations related to Nathan's personal life. Based on the accumulated evidence and testimony, the police decided to consider Daniel William the prime suspect in the murder of Samantha Nance. His actions and behavior raised serious doubts, and the evidence found was substantial. Investigators carefully recorded every step, from Nathan's messages to the findings in the bathroom and video recordings of purchases. It was clear that the investigation was entering a new phase, and a decisive stage lay ahead: the interrogation of the suspect. Meanwhile, Nathan continued to cooperate with the investigation, providing important information about the nature of the relationship and personal conflicts that could have motivated the crime. His help was invaluable, despite the emotional pain he was experiencing. The investigators understood that the case was complex and multifaceted, ranging from analyzing personal relationships to examining technical evidence. It was necessary to thoroughly check all versions and not overlook a single detail. Daniel William was summoned for questioning at the police station a few days after the initial investigation. The official date of the interrogation was mid-September 2009, a few days after the tragic discovery of Samantha Nance's body. The investigators prepared thoroughly for this meeting, armed with all the evidence they had gathered and a detailed analysis of witness statements. They understood that talking to Daniel could be the key to solving the case. When Daniel entered the interrogation room, his behavior was immediately noticeable. It was in stark contrast to the calm and dejected demeanor of Nathan Shack, another important participant in the investigation. While Nathan appeared composed and overwhelmed with grief, Daniel looked tense and nervous. His movements were sharp, his gaze often wandered, and his voice trembled and sounded uncertain. The police officers immediately realized that they were dealing with a man who was trying to control himself but was under severe stress. The interrogation began in the usual way, with investigators asking standard questions: where he was on the day of the murder, what his relationship with Samantha was like, and what he thought about what had happened. However, Daniel's answers were confusing and inconsistent. He got mixed up with dates, answered simple questions uncertainly, and changed his testimony several times. This only heightened suspicions, because normally a person who is not involved in a crime usually strives to give a clear and consistent account. The investigators understood that direct pressure at this point would only close the door to candor, so they chose a tactic of gently leading him to key questions. Gradually, the conversation turned to details that were troubling the police. The blood-stained clothing found in the suspect's closet, as well as other incriminating evidence. At that point, one of the detectives showed Daniel photographs of his clothes, which clearly showed bloodstains that matched Samantha's DNA. This was followed by CCTV footage from a Walmart store showing Daniel buying gloves, hair dye, and soap, items that investigators believed he had used to cover up the crime. The results of laboratory tests only increased the pressure. The tests confirmed that the blood on his clothes belonged to Samantha, and the blue material found was part of the gloves he had purchased. All this evidence created an impenetrable chain, leaving the suspect with no chance of acquittal. Under such pressure, Daniel began to give ground. His voice became less confident, his eyes filled with inner turmoil. Soon he confessed that he hated Samantha. On that fateful day, his emotions were running high, and in a fit of jealousy and anger, he committed the murder. Daniel also revealed that throughout the day he had been sending messages pretending to be Samantha, using the name of her neighbor Ashley Olvera. This ruse was intended to confuse the investigation, create a false alibi, and divert attention away from himself. However, the carefully crafted messages failed to mislead the police. Experts identified anomalies in the writing style and time of sending, which allowed them to identify the real author. During his confession, Daniel not only did not deny what he had done, but also explained his motives in detail. Jealousy of Nathan, feelings of betrayal, and pain over Samantha's intention to end their relationship. His words and emotions were full of bitterness and anger, indicating a deep inner conflict. Investigators felt that they were dealing with a murderer who was fully aware of his actions and was not trying to hide. His confession and emotional openness coincided with the evidence gathered and witness statements, which made the case virtually open and shut. After several hours of questioning, Daniel William was officially arrested. This happened immediately after his confession. He was charged with first-degree murder, the premeditated and brutal killing of a young woman. News of the arrest quickly spread among students, teachers, and residents of the city. The public reacted with alarm and excitement. Samantha's parents felt a long-awaited sense of relief. Although no verdict could bring their daughter back, they were grateful that justice was beginning to prevail. From that moment on, the investigation focused on preparing the case for trial. The police continued to gather the final pieces of evidence to ensure the strongest possible case. Daniel's interrogation was a turning point that gave the investigation a powerful boost and brought it closer to answering the agonizing questions that Samantha's loved ones had been asking themselves. The trial of Daniel Willem became an event that attracted the attention not only of Dallas residents but also of the general public interested in investigations and crime stories. Almost a year and a half had passed since the defendant's arrest, and by the fall of 2011 the case files had been carefully prepared and both sides The prosecution and the defense were ready for intense court hearings. The trial took place amid heightened security measures. The murder of a young art student sparked heated debate, and the emotional tension in the courtroom was palpable. Samantha Nance's parents, who had suffered an irreparable loss, struggled to hold back tears, while representatives of the student community and teachers came to support the memory of the young woman. The media actively covered the trial, emphasizing the importance of the case and the need to achieve justice. The prosecution presented detailed evidence. Forensic evidence linking Daniel to the crime scene was a central element of the case. DNA tests confirmed that Samantha's blood was found on the defendant's clothing, and surveillance camera footage showed him going to a Walmart store on the day of the murder, where he purchased gloves, soap, and hair dye, items that, according to the investigation, were used to cover up the traces. Daniel's confession was also a strong argument, as he did not deny his guilt and described in detail the motives and circumstances of the crime. Witness testimony reinforced the prosecution's case. Samantha's friend, Ashley Olvera, gave detailed descriptions of the victim's mood and behavior in the days leading up to the tragedy, as well as the strange messages and threats Samantha had received. Psychology experts were also called in to describe Daniel's character and motivation, emphasizing that jealousy and emotional instability could have led to tragic consequences. On the other hand, the defense attorneys attempted to build a case mitigating the defendant's responsibility. They referred to his psychological state and emotional difficulties, emphasizing that William suffered from severe internal conflict and was unable to control his actions at the time of the crime. The defense also attempted to challenge some technical aspects of the expert reports, arguing that there were possible errors in the analyses and the procedure for collecting evidence. The court proceedings lasted several weeks. Each side examined and discussed the evidence presented in detail, trying to convince the court of its case. The prosecution lawyers insisted that Daniel's actions were premeditated, emphasizing that the murder was committed in a state of anger and jealousy, and that attempts to cover up the crime only confirmed its deliberate nature. During the trial, the judge paid particular attention to details: the accuracy of expert reports, the consistency of testimony, and the defendant's motives. Particular importance was attached to the confessions, which formed a significant part of the evidence. Samantha's parents and relatives who were present at the hearings showed restraint and dignity, although it was obvious that each day of the trial was an emotional ordeal for them. They wanted this process to bring justice to their daughter and preserve her memory. Public opinion was divided. Some believed that the charges were well-founded and that the punishment should be severe, while others expressed sympathy for the defendant, emphasizing the importance of understanding the psychological aspects of the crime. Despite this, the trial proceeded within the bounds of the law and impartiality. Finally, after intensive hearings and consideration of all the evidence, the day of the verdict arrived. A tense silence reigned in the courtroom as everyone waited for the judge to announce his decision. On November 4, 2011, the Dallas court found Daniel William guilty of the first-degree murder of Samantha Nance and of concealing evidence of the crime. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Rosa Maria Peral Vallejo was born on October 6, 1918, in the Sant Andreu neighborhood in northern Barcelona. Her family was modest, typical of the Spanish working class in the early 1918s. Her father, José Peral, worked as a mechanic in the municipal car fleet, and her mother, Lourdes Vallejo, was a nurse at the local clinic. Rosa was the first child, and 3 years after her birth, she had a younger brother, Gabriel. The family lived modestly but happily. Rosa's parents had conservative views. They did not live extravagantly, but they were orderly. From childhood, Rosa was taught qualities such as punctuality, restraint, and respect for her elders. Her mother often repeated to her, "Silence is golden," especially when accompanied by a straight back and a clear conscience. These words encapsulated the entire philosophy of their life. Her father was gentler but demanding in business. He believed that hard work and discipline were the main assets a parent could give their child. Rose was a good student, but without any particular distinctions. She was diligent, focused, and always punctual. Her school friends recalled that she was never late and never cheated, but didn't like it when someone stood out, either for good or bad deeds. Even then, there was a sense of her inner need to control her environment. After school, Rosa tried her hand at law school, but after 2 semesters she realized that theoretical work was not for her. She was attracted to concrete action, movement, and clear rules. In 2001, she enrolled in the Catalan Police Academy, and in 2003 she began serving in the Guàrdia Urbana de Barcelona, the municipal police force. The job came easily to her. She quickly settled in, earned the respect of her colleagues, and began working in a patrol unit. To outsiders, Rosa seemed like the ideal employee, responsible, physically fit, and not prone to conflict. But behind her professional demeanor lay a person with a rich inner life and complex personal relationships. In 2012, Rosa met Albert Lopez, a colleague from another operational team. He was a couple of years older, charming, athletic, with an open smile and clear speech. They first got close while on duty together at a large event. A few weeks later, they started dating. The relationship was passionate and complicated. 2 strong personalities, 2 employees of the same organization who knew how quickly trust could be destroyed within a close-knit team. Their romance lasted about 3 years, but the end was turbulent. According to those close to them, Albert was prone to jealous outbursts and sometimes became overly possessive, especially after Rosa began to rebuild her relationship with her ex-husband, Ruben, the father of her 2 daughters. Albert couldn't accept this. At some point, he began to make jealous scenes and issue ultimatums. In 2015, Rosa ended the relationship. She explained it simply: he wants to control everything too much. Although they officially broke up, they did not completely lose contact. They still worked in the same department, crossed paths at meetings, and sometimes did things together. The peace that Rosa so desperately lacked in her relationship with Albert, she found in Pedro Rodriguez. Pedro had served in the Guardia Urbana since 2004, was respected by his colleagues, and was known as a professional who could keep his cool in any situation. He was a few years older than Rosa, divorced, and had no children. Their romance began in 2016. Almost immediately, Pedro became part of her everyday life. He was familiar with her children, spent weekends at her home, and they went on outings together. Unlike Albert, he did not ask unnecessary questions, did not make scenes, and did not check her phone. Colleagues described them as a real couple. Serious, well-balanced, focused on work and family. However, traces of the past continued to creep into this stability. The name Albert Lopez still came up in conversation, sometimes indirectly, sometimes directly. Colleagues knew that tensions between Pedro and Albert were growing. There were rumors that Albert had not let go of the past and was periodically trying to resume contact with Rosa. In the spring of 2017, changes began to be noticed in the department. Rosa looked tense, Pedro looked pensive. One day, Albert and Pedro exchanged harsh words in the locker room, and, according to one of the police officers, you could cut the air with a knife. But all this remained an internal conflict, at least until one May morning. It was May 4, 2017. The morning was warm, with a light haze over the hills outside Barcelona. In the municipality of Foyos, in the Calissarap district, a local resident noticed thick clouds of smoke rising behind a hill near an abandoned country road. At first he thought that dry leaves were burning somewhere in the distance. Seasonal fires were not uncommon in these parts. But as he got closer, he realized that the flames were coming from a car. The fire was intense and almost uncontrollable. The car was completely burned out, and even the metal began to melt under the heat. The man called the emergency services. Firefighters arrived at the scene a few minutes later, followed by the police. At that point, no one knew who owned the charred car. When the emergency services arrived at the scene, The fire had almost been extinguished. Smoke was still rising from the charred car, turning the morning air gray, but there were no open flames. Only the skeleton of a Seat Ibiza passenger car remained. The body had swelled from the heat, the windows had burst, and the rubber parts, including tires, gaskets, and seals, had melted into streaks running down the metal. The site was in a sparsely populated area not far from the intersection of rural roads between Foyos and the Kalsarap Nature Reserve, on a stretch where the asphalt gave way to a dusty track. Along the road were only a few bushes and dry grass, among which lay the wreckage of plastic and burnt car parts. There were no surveillance cameras, no buses passed by, and even cell phone reception was unstable. Someone knew exactly where to go. The first thing that struck the firefighters and police as strange was how carefully the arson had been planned. The fire was not accidental. Traces of an accelerant were found in the car. Preliminary estimates suggested gasoline or a similar flammable liquid. The source of the fire was located in the passenger compartment and the rear of the vehicle, indicating a deliberate attempt to destroy the contents of the trunk. One of the investigators, Senior Inspector Jordi Casas, later wrote in his report, "A typical case of arson with the aim of destroying evidence. The work of either an amateur who has seen such scenes in movies or a professional trying to look like an amateur." When the temperature inside the car dropped, forensic officers began their initial examination. Under the trunk lid, where the charred panels had slightly opened due to heat deformation, they found the key element that turned the incident into an emergency: fragments of human remain. Everything indicated that the body was inside the car at the time of the arson. It was completely charred, making visual identification impossible. The skull and pelvic bones were lying separately from the torso, suggesting either that the body had been moved before being burned or that it had been thermally destroyed. Due to the high temperature, the bones began to disintegrate and the soft tissues disappeared almost completely. Investigators immediately cordoned off the area. A special team of forensic experts was called in, as well as a unit specializing in the analysis of combustible substances. All bystanders, including the first police officers who arrived at the scene, were removed from the area where potential evidence could be found. The car was identified by its VIN number, chassis identification number, engraved on the frame and preserved under the hood. Data from the Ministry of Internal Affairs database confirmed that the vehicle was registered to Pedro Rodriguez Jimenez, 38, an employee of the Guardia Urbana de Barcelona. At this stage, the investigation could not yet say with 100% certainty that it was him in the trunk, but the probability was high. Any doubts were dispelled when forensic experts found a metal hip replacement among the remains. Medical records confirmed that Pedro Rodriguez had undergone hip replacement surgery several years earlier, and the model of the implant matched the one found. The head of the investigation team, Commissioner Ernesto Fernandez, later admitted in an interview, "At that point, it looked like a carefully planned murder followed by the disposal of the body. But one thing surprised us. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no traces of blood. Everything had been burned away. It was either a coincidence or the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Investigators searched the surrounding area for tire tracks, footprints, and any evidence that might have survived. 20 meters from the car, behind some bushes, they found a plastic gasoline container with traces of fuel and partially burned fingerprints. It was sent to the lab. In addition, 2 pieces of black electrical tape and a piece of a rubber glove melted in the grass were found. At the same time, CCTV footage was being examined. Recordings from the BV 2002 highway and nearby gas stations were checked. One of the cameras, located 9 kilometers from the scene of the arson, recorded a vehicle resembling a Seat at 3:17 a.m., 2 hours after Pedro Rodriguez stopped communicating, according to mobile phone records. This time gap immediately became the subject of analysis. At this stage, the case was still classified as discovery of a body in a fire. Formally, it was not murder, disappearance, or accident. Only facts: a burned-out car, a badly charred body, the remains of a metal implant and electrical tape, and a location chosen with remarkable precision. But the more the forensic experts studied the scene, the clearer it became that this location had not been chosen at random. It had been chosen precisely because it was rarely visited, especially at night. The landscape left no chance for witnesses. There were no residential buildings within a kilometer, and the nearest surveillance camera was at the intersection of the highway 9 kilometers from the scene. Tire tracks leading to the fire were partially erased, but still visible. They were measured and photographed. Attempts were made to determine the direction of entry and exit, but one track disappeared in a pile of gravel, and the other led off toward a dirt road. Forensic experts carefully collected samples of soil, soot, burnt gasoline residue, and charred materials. There were no identifiable documents, phones, or wallets left on the surface. Everything had disappeared in the fire. Whoever set this car on fire had at least a basic understanding of how investigators work. They didn't leave any easy clues. There were hardly any charred pieces of clothing left. At around 3:00 p.m., the first internal report stated the following. A male corpse has been found in the trunk of a burned-out car. The car belongs to a police officer. The circumstances are suspicious. The incident is suspected to be of criminal origin. An internal investigation has been launched. That was the end of the first day. The fire was extinguished, the scene was examined, evidence was packed up, and the body was sent for examination. The main thing remained: to understand who, when, and why ended up in this car, and who did everything to ensure that no one would ever find out. The investigation entered its active phase the day after the burned-out car was discovered. Early in the morning of May 5, a task force was assembled at the headquarters of the Guardia Urbana de Barcelona, consisting of criminal police officers, forensic experts, and representatives of the Internal Security Department, as the deceased was a serving officer. The units were coordinated by Inspector Arnel Torres, a man with 20 years of experience and a reputation for being meticulous, who had handled more than one internal case involving police officers. The team's first task was to divide the investigation into 2 parallel lines: establishing the exact circumstances of the victim's death and gathering information about his personal life in recent weeks. According to initial data, Pedro Rodriguez died on the night of May 3 to 4. The investigation relied on 2 key sources: data from mobile devices and the conclusions of forensic experts. Forensic experts confirmed that the body had been exposed to fire after death. There were no signs of burns on the bones, characteristic of a living organism at the moment of ignition. This meant that the murder took place elsewhere, and the body was then transported. This led to a second logical assumption. The killer, or killers, must have had the means to transport the body, access to a car, and at least basic knowledge of how to destroy evidence. While the experts worked on the remains, the forensic team set about reconstructing the route taken. Within a few hours, they had requested and obtained a full breakdown of Pedro's phone calls, messages, and geolocation data. The last recorded signal from his mobile device was at 11:58 p.m. on May 3rd, within a residential area in the Prat de Llobregat district, about 10 kilometers from where his car was found the next morning. After that, there was no further activity. The next step was to locate other mobile devices that were near the body. The police database made it possible to quickly determine which subscribers were within a 500-meter radius of the arson site between midnight and 5 a.m. There were only a few matches. This immediately attracted attention. 2 mobile phone numbers registered to private individuals appeared in the signal zone almost simultaneously with Pedro's disappearance. At that point, investigators did not know who exactly was in the area or what their purpose was. It was decided not to act prematurely, but to conduct a quiet check using traffic data. With the help of surveillance cameras at a gas station 8 kilometers from Colserap, it was possible to find fragmentary images of a car visually similar to a vehicle previously owned by one of the police officers. The footage was blurry. But the camera captured the moment when the car was being refueled. A woman whose face was partially hidden by a hood was in the frame. This footage would later become one of the pieces of circumstantial evidence. Meanwhile, detectives began gathering detailed information about Pedro's daily life. A complete map of his movements over the last week was drawn up, and his colleagues, friends, and closest neighbors were interviewed. One of his co-workers reported that Pedro had seemed nervous in recent days, mentioning problems at home and that he needed to decide something. This statement prompted investigators to focus on his close circle of friends. At work, he most often interacted with two employees from his department, Rosa Perol and Albert Lopez. Formally, this did not give grounds to suspect them, but investigators knew that Perol was in a romantic relationship with Pedro, and Lopez had previously been her partner. There were persistent rumors that there were personal conflicts between the three colleagues. Internal reports showed that Pedro and Albert had been involved in several domestic altercations outside of work, one of which had almost escalated into a fight in the barracks courtyard. The incident report had been hushed up, but now it took on new significance. At the same time, an analysis of social media and messenger activity was carried out. An interesting fact: on the night of Pedro's disappearance, several messages were sent from his phone. One was to his brother, the other to his ex-wife. Both messages were short and contained phrases such as "everything is fine" and "don't worry." But the text raised doubt. Relatives claimed that the style of writing did not match Pedro's usual manner, especially the use of certain abbreviations and punctuation. This detail led investigators to hypothesize that someone may have used his phone after his death to create the illusion that he was still alive. A key step was obtaining information from cell phone operators. At the request of the prosecutor's office, data was obtained on the location of Rosa and Albert's devices on the night of May 3 to 4. They showed an important coincidence. Both phones left the city center at around midnight and moved almost simultaneously towards the suburbs, where the burned-out car was later found. The signals from their devices were recorded near the very road leading to the crime scene. They returned to the city around 5 a.m. This information could no longer be considered a coincidence. The investigation entered a phase of direct suspicion. The investigators summoned both of them for a second interview. The conversation with Rosa Perol took place in a relaxed atmosphere, but with clear procedural recording. When asked where she had been during the night, Rosa stated that she had been at home with her children. However, when she was shown a printout of her phone's movements, she fell silent. The investigators deliberately avoided making any harsh statements. The goal was not to scare her, but to give her a chance to get confused, and Rosa did indeed begin to change her testimony. In one version, she said that she had gone out on business. In another, that she did not remember. Perhaps she had left her phone in the car. The inconsistencies were recorded in the protocol. Albert Lopez, on the other hand, took an aggressive stance. He claimed that he had nothing to do with Pedro's death, and that on the night of May 3-4, he was driving around on personal business, which he was not obliged to explain to anyone. But his movements also coincided with the route leading to the crime scene. When asked why his phone was in the same area as Rosa's, he replied sharply, "We are adults. Maybe we met. So, what? It's not a crime." But his sharpness only heightened suspicions. At this stage, the prosecutor authorized searches of both suspects' apartments. Documents, mobile devices, and a laptop were seized from Rosa's apartment. An old mobile phone registered to someone else was found in the attic of the house, wrapped in a thick bag. This phone, as it later turned out, was used exclusively to communicate with one subscriber, Albert Lopez. Its contents were a real gift for the investigation. Dozens of messages, forwarded coordinates, photos, encrypted phrases, and hints that together painted a picture of a secret conspiracy. Gloves with traces of combustible substances and boots with fragments of trampled electrical tape were found in Albert's home. Experts proved that the type of marks on the soles matched the fragments found at the scene of the arson. This was a direct link to the crime scene. By the end of the second week of the investigation, the picture was becoming clearer. There was a motive, A love triangle. Jealousy. A desire to get rid of a rival. There was evidence. Phones, cameras, digital traces. There was evidence. Duct tape, fuel, traces on clothing. And there were statements that became more and more contradictory with each passing day. The investigation was entering the home stretch. The suspects were known. All that remained was to secure the evidence and take the next step: the arrest. The operation to arrest the suspects was planned for the morning of May 14, 2017, exactly 10 days after the body was found. By this point, the investigation had gathered enough direct and circumstantial evidence to open a criminal case for intentional murder. The prosecutor authorized the arrest of 2 individuals, Rosa Maria Perol and Albert Lopez. The decision to arrest them together was made for security and tactical reasons, to prevent them from colluding or destroying additional evidence. The operation took place simultaneously at 2 locations. At 6 in the morning, a group of 4 plainclothes officers arrived at Rosa's house in the Sant Boi de Llobregat neighborhood. The house was located in a residential area with narrow streets and dense buildings. The officers quietly entered the yard and knocked on the door. The woman who opened the door looked sleepy but not frightened. She was not handcuffed in front of her children. The officers followed standard protocol. First, they presented their warrant, then invited her to the station for questioning. Rosa asked, "Is this about Pedro?" Her voice was steady. According to one of the officers, this made an alarming impression. "That's not how someone in shock talks." She knew why we were there. At the same time, in another part of Barcelona, in the Aix-en-Pallais district, Albert was being arrested. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modern residential complex. Police officers found the man already on his feet. He looked wary but did not resist, according to them. He was asked to gather his documents, and 15 minutes later, he was in a car heading for the detention center. The first thing he said when he got into the car was, "She tricked you all." He did not give his name. Rosa's first official interrogation took place in the presence of a lawyer. She looked tired but remained composed. She answered most questions briefly. She refused to explain why her phone was in the Calcerap area on the night of Pedro's disappearance, citing inability to remember the route exactly. When she was shown a printout of messages sent from the deceased's phone, she said, "I didn't write them. I didn't even know he was dead." However, even this statement contradicted her earlier explanations in which she claimed that she thought Pedro had left. Albert behaved differently during the interrogation. He immediately began to shift the blame onto Rosa, claiming that she had lured him into this mess and that he had been drawn into the situation without knowing the whole picture. According to him, on the night of May 3rd, 4, he came to her at her request and later helped her take something out of town. He did not specify what exactly, but the investigators already understood what he was talking about. When he was shown photographs of the seized shoes and traces at the scene of the arson, he did not comment, only shrugged his shoulders. The investigation continued for several more days, but the main elements had already been established in the operational phase. The evidence collected at the homes of both suspects was supplemented by the results of expert examinations, traces of combustible substances, digital tags, and analysis of correspondence. All of this fit into a coherent plan. The victim was eliminated, the body was hidden, and then the illusion was created that he had left on his own, sending messages. 48 hours after their arrest, a Barcelona court decided to remand Rosa Perol and Albert Lopez in custody. They were transferred to different prisons, Rosa to the Brianzai women's prison, and Albert to the Cuatro Camins men's prison. At the hearing to determine the preventive measure, neither of them pleaded guilty. Their lawyers insisted that the evidence was circumstantial and could not prove their client's direct involvement in the murder. Meanwhile, public attention to the case grew. The press had already dubbed it urban crime, a reference to the service where all 3 worked. Rumors were circulating in police circles that the case would have widespread repercussions. One officer told a journalist, on condition of anonymity, "Everyone in our department knew everything. It was a ticking time bomb. The arrest was a turning point. The investigation no longer had any doubts. This was a murder, committed deliberately and not by a lone individual. A long road to trial began, where every word, every piece of evidence, every minute of the night of May 3 to 4 would have to be examined second by second. The trial for the murder of Pedro Rodriguez began on February 3, 2020, in the Barcelona Provincial Court. The courtroom was filled not only with those involved in the case, but also with representatives of the press, colleagues, and relatives of the deceased. The trial was immediately deemed high risk in terms of public interest and was provided with enhanced security. The defendants, Rosa Peral and Albert Lopez, were seated separately in the courtroom. By this point, they had refused to communicate with each other and were defending themselves separately, presenting their own versions of events. The prosecution charged them with premeditated murder, concealment of a body, and abuse of office. The main line of accusation was that the crime had been planned in advance and that the defendants' actions were coordinated. The prosecutor insisted these two acted together, driven by jealousy, fear of exposure, and a desire to eliminate the person who stood between them. They knew how to hide the evidence. They used their official positions to mislead the investigation. The defense, on the other hand, built its case on mutual accusations. Albert's lawyer claimed that his client was a tool who had been drawn into the situation under pressure and blackmail. Rosa's lawyer put forward a version according to which the woman had acted under threat of physical violence from her former partner. Both sides tried to portray their clients as victims of circumstances and emotional instability, but the evidence told a different story. Key to the trial were the testimonies of experts in digital data, mobile device tracking, and analysis of text messages sent from Pedro's phone after his death. Seized evidence also played a role, including shoes that left prints matching those at the scene of the arson, and a gasoline canister with DNA residue. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The hearings were accompanied by emotional moments. Pedro's relatives left the courtroom in tears on several occasions, and on one day, security had to interrupt the hearing due to a conflict between journalists and friends of the defendants. Despite this, the trial proceeded within the established procedure, and the judge did not allow any disruptions or pressure from the public. On March 13, 2020, the Barcelona Provincial Court found Rosa Maria Perallo Vallejo guilty of crimes under the Spanish Criminal Code: intentional homicide, concealment of a body, and abuse of public office. On March 16, 2020, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the right to appeal the verdict no earlier than 20 years after her release. On the same day, March 13, 2020, the same court found Albert Lopez Olter guilty of complicity in intentional murder and concealment of a body. On March 16, 2020, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with similar conditions for review of his sentence. Belinda Lucas was born on October 11, 1968 in Dallas, Texas. She grew up in a traditional middle-class family that valued honesty, hard work, and family values. Her father, James Lucas, was an engineer, and her mother, Sarah, was a homemaker. Belinda was the eldest of 3 children, and her family always had a supportive and loving atmosphere. From an early age, she showed a keen interest in learning and reading, and her parents were proud of her achievements at school. From childhood, Belinda was known for her kindness and open personality. She was an excellent student, an active participant in school activities, and also took part in volunteer projects. In high school, she became one of the leaders of the student council, organizing events and working with young people. Her school teachers often spoke of her as a talented and energetic person who could inspire others by her example. After graduating from high school, Belinda enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin, where she chose to major in education. She had always dreamed of becoming a teacher, and it was her sincere desire. At university, she was an active student, participating in various clubs and organizations, as well as volunteering in school programs for children with disabilities. Her professional ambitions were clear. She wanted to work with children, help them reach their potential, and be a mentor to them. Belinda graduated from university with honors and immediately began working as an elementary school teacher. Her career was going well. She was recognized as one of the best teachers at her school and was highly respected by her colleagues. Working with children, she always strove to create a warm and supportive atmosphere for them. Despite their young age, her students always remembered her as someone who had a significant impact on their development. Belinda's personal life was also fulfilling. She was in several relationships over the years, but true love came when she met David Temple. They met in 1995 at a school teachers meeting in Houston. David, a former American football and physical education coach, was a bright and confident man who immediately caught Belinda's attention. David was the kind of person who at first glance gave the impression of being successful and ambitious, and Belinda was no exception. She immediately felt that there was a special connection between them. They started talking, and after a few months, their relationship became more serious. David was charismatic, attractive, and very confident, which attracted Belinda. She found him an interesting conversationalist, and his athletic lifestyle, energy, and enthusiasm for his work won her over. After several months of dating, Belinda and David got married in 1996. Many of their friends and family were convinced that they were a couple who would be happy together. David and Belinda seemed like the perfect couple. Belinda with her calm nature and kindness, and David with his ambition and drive to succeed, were a harmonious match. The wedding was modest but very touching. Belinda even said that with David she felt completely fulfilled and happy. They started their life together in the suburbs of Houston, in a house that became their cozy family nest. There were many joyful moments in their marriage, but there were also periods when Belinda began to notice that her relationship with David was not as perfect as it seemed at first glance. They built a life together and had a son who became the center of their family world. Belinda devoted herself to raising her child, while David continued his career as a coach, working with children and teenagers. David was often busy at work, which caused some misunderstandings in their relationship. Belinda, despite her professional career, always considered her role in the family to be the most important. Like many couples, the spouses faced communication problems and everyday difficulties, but they remained close to each other. Their son was their pride and joy, and Belinda was ready to do anything to create the best conditions for his growth and development. January the 12th, 1999 began like any other day in Belinda Temple's life. She was preparing breakfast, getting ready for work, and planning to meet with colleagues and students. However, that day would be the last of her life. Belinda was 8 months pregnant, and her life was just beginning. She was expecting her second child, but fate had other plans. On the morning of that day, Belinda had no idea that her life would be cut short while she was home alone. What exactly happened that day was a question that had no clear answer in the first minutes after the tragedy. When David returned home and discovered his wife, he immediately called the police. He reported that his wife had been killed in a robbery. These words marked the beginning of a long investigation that would soon reveal the terrible truth about what had really happened. The Temple family home was located in a quiet residential neighborhood that had always been considered a safe place to live and raise children. It was a 2-story house in a typical American style, with a small yard and garden. Outwardly, everything looked normal. There was a toy stroller in the yard and curtains hanging in the kitchen window, reminiscent of family comfort. But on that day, January 11th, the scene inside the house was far from cool. When the police arrived at the scene, they met David Temple, who said he had just returned home and discovered the horrific scene. He was calm, almost detached, when he reported that his wife had been killed in a robbery. However, his behavior raised questions for investigators. His excessive calmness and lack of shock or real distress immediately raised suspicions. But the police could not afford to jump to conclusions until they had examined the crime scene. When investigators entered the house, they immediately noticed that the scene did not match the typical picture of a robbery. The doors and windows of the house were intact, and there were no signs of damage or obvious signs that the robbers had tried to force their way into the house. However, There were several items scattered haphazardly on the floor in one of the rooms. The room where Belinda was found was located on the first floor. It was a cozy and bright corner with a small sofa, bookshelves, and decorations that evoked the warm atmosphere of home. Belinda's body was in the center of the room, on the floor, next to an armchair that she may have used to relax before doing her chores. Her position on the floor was strange, as if she had been trying to stand up but had fallen at some point. Belinda was dead, and the first thing that caught the eye was that she was dressed in her home clothes, as if she had not expected anything to happen to her. She had not been the victim of a violent struggle. The police found no signs of violence in the form of bruises or injuries, but the discovery of the body in such a position suggested that she may have been taken by surprise. There were traces of blood on her body, but no visible injuries that could indicate a violent attack. However, several strange details immediately caught the investigators' attention. First, there were no signs that the house had been ransacked, as is often the case in a robbery, with items scattered around the room. All valuables, including televisions, electronic devices, money, and jewelry, remained in place. It also seemed strange that the door to the house was open but had not been forced open. Usually in a robbery, the door is broken down, or at least an attempt is made to break in through the windows. However, nothing of the sort was found at the scene. Details related to the crime scene raised many questions. After examining the rooms, investigators began looking for clues that could give them an idea of what had actually happened. First of all, several strange elements caught their attention, indicating that the scene could have been staged. For example, bloodstains on the clothes and floor indicated that Belinda had most likely been shot at close range. Although her body was lying in a room where there appeared to be no signs of a struggle, the shot had been fired from close range. This meant that the perpetrator could have been someone close to her, and the shot was most likely unexpected. In addition, investigators noticed one important detail. The weapon that David claimed was used in the murder was found in the kitchen. It did not look like something a criminal would leave behind, especially if it was a robbery gone wrong. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, and David claimed that it did not belong to him but to the perpetrator. Another important point was that David claimed not to have heard the shot. His claims that he did not notice anything seemed implausible. There were no signs in the house that he had tried to check what had happened or contact his neighbors. The police also noted that the windows in the house were closed and the ventilation did not allow strangers to enter the house. This indicated that the criminal may have been familiar with the house and may have planned the crime in advance. In addition to the oddities at the crime scene, the neighbors' statements were also important. Some of them heard strange noises that sounded like an argument before they heard the police sirens. However, none of them could say for sure what had happened in the house. These statements only reinforced the suspicion that what had happened was something more than just a random robbery. In addition, investigators soon learned that Belinda had been in contact with several people on the day of the murder. She had arranged to meet a colleague after finishing her chores at home. Her last call was made about an hour before David reported the incident. Witness statements and phone records showed that she was in the process of planning her life after the birth of her second child, which created another mystery. Why kill her when she was in such a position? The house where the murder took place was located in a quiet, upscale neighborhood where such crimes did not usually occur. It was unusual for neighbors and local residents to hear about violence in the area, which only added to the shock and confusion. However, as the investigation continued, it became clear that this was far from a random crime. The evidence at the crime scene, the lack of obvious signs of a struggle, and David Temple's strange calmness raised many questions for investigators. After investigators examined the crime scene, they discovered several critical inconsistencies that did not match David's version of the robbery. First, there were no signs of forced entry or struggle in the house, which would be typical signs of a robbery. All valuables, televisions, money, jewelry remained in their places. In contrast, burglars usually leave a mess, scattering things around to grab everything of value quickly. This was not the case here. and the crime scene looked too organized to be the result of a robbery. With each passing day, it became increasingly clear that the robbery theory did not hold water. David, however, continued to insist that it was indeed a robbery and that the killer was a stranger. The investigators were forced to accept his testimony as their starting point, but they could not ignore the numerous contradictions. It was at this time that the first important clues began to emerge, which seemed unrelated to the case, but ultimately played a key role in changing the direction of the investigation. As soon as investigators began working with David's data and his circle, details of his personal life began to emerge, which later proved decisive. The investigation continued, and over the course of several months, investigators began to gather information about David Temple's personal life. Parallel to the murder investigation, details of his affair with another woman came to light. This information became a key factor, as it not only revealed a motive, but also showed that David may have wanted to get rid of his wife. After becoming part of Belinda and David's circle of friends and acquaintances, investigators began to hear stories that ultimately revealed the true nature of the couple's relationship. Even before Belinda's murder, there were rumors that their marriage was not going well. Belinda suspected her husband of infidelity, and this became a topic of conversation among their mutual acquaintances. According to investigators, these suspicions were well-founded, and it soon became known that David was indeed having an affair with another woman. At first, investigators were unable to fully confirm these rumors, but as they delved deeper into the case, new facts began to emerge. Secret correspondence, witnesses, and even photos on social media confirmed the existence of a long-term relationship between David and a woman named Jennifer, whom he had been dating before Belinda's murder. This discovery gave the investigation new momentum and allowed investigators to consider the real motive for the murder. David Temple was clearly deeply involved in a relationship with Jennifer, and this circumstance became an important element in the investigation. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the motive for the murder was not financial gain or an accident, but a desire to get rid of his wife in order to be with his mistress. However, despite all the suspicions and revelations about his personal life, investigators still did not have enough evidence to charge David Temple with murder when the trial began. Although there were clear contradictions in David's personal life and his affair with Jennifer had become public knowledge, this was not enough to bring the case to court. In 2004, when the investigation finally reached the trial stage, it was slowed down by a significant problem: the lack of hard evidence linking David directly to the murder. Despite all the evidence that had accumulated during the investigation, including the love affair and motive, the investigation failed to provide concrete physical evidence such as fingerprints, DNA, or eyewitness testimony. This circumstance played a key role in the case not going to trial. At that point, investigators could not prove that the murder had been premeditated, and there was no material evidence that could convince the court of David's guilt. Ultimately, the case was suspended and no charges were filed. Despite clear doubts about the veracity of David's testimony, the police were forced to leave the case in limbo. The prosecution was unable to gather enough compelling evidence to take the case to court, and it was closed indefinitely. This decision meant that none of the key elements of the investigation, including his romantic relationships and strange behavior, were deemed sufficient to bring charges. After the case failed to go to court, it was closed and sent to the archives. Over the course of several years, the investigation was discontinued, and all evidence, documents, and materials collected during the investigation were put away in boxes. The public and the media that had been following the case began to lose interest, and the tragedy of Belinda Temple faded into the background. With each passing year, as the case remained unsolved, fewer and fewer people were interested in its continuation. Belinda's family, who had suffered an irreparable loss, found themselves in a difficult situation, not knowing how to go on without answers to their questions about what had happened to their beloved relative. Meanwhile, David Temple's life continued as usual. He remained at work, and his relationship with Jennifer continued. All his actions were closely monitored by the public, but with each passing year, his life became less and less noticeable. He married Jennifer, and the world seemed peaceful, despite the dark secret that hung over him. The Belinda Temple case proved to be complex, confusing, and tragic for all involved. Despite numerous suspicions, a lack of evidence, and the inability to bring charges meant that the case was never properly concluded. Investigators were unable to bring it to trial, and it was closed. This was the tragic icing on the cake for Belinda's family, whose lives had been destroyed and justice left unfulfilled. Almost 2 decades have passed since Belinda Temple was found dead in her home in Katy. For almost as long, the case has been gathering dust in police archives, with no one daring to close it for good, but with nothing to move it forward. The lack of direct evidence, inconclusive clues, and most importantly, influential public pressure and the fine line between suspicion and accusation kept David Temple's name off the official list of suspects for years. However, in 2016, there was an unexpected and long-awaited turn in the case. The key catalyst for the reinvestigation was the initiative of a new team of prosecutors who came to power in Harris County. Among them was prosecutor Casey Garrett, who at the time was known for his attention to unsolved cases. When he studied the materials remaining in the Temple case, he was alarmed by many questions that had remained unanswered for many years. But it was not only an internal reassessment of the case that led to its reopening. Independent analysts and criminologists were brought in by the prosecutor's office as part of a program to review cases involving possible judicial errors and investigative shortcomings. They conducted a fresh analysis of the existing evidence using new technologies and methods that were not available in 1999. The main discovery was a more accurate comparison of time data, phone calls, movements, and phone activity, as well as witness statements. GPS systems, analysis of mobile device records, and more accurate time mapping allowed the team of investigators to identify contradictions in David Temple's alibi. He claimed to have been in a certain place at the time of his wife's death, but digital data showed that his car and phone were in a completely different area, closer to his home. In addition, investigators focused on thoroughly re-examining the facts already known. The motive was examined from a new angle. David's love affair, which had previously seemed a minor aspect, now took center stage. It turned out that by the time Belinda Temple died, David's relationship with Jennifer had begun not a few months before the tragedy, as he claimed, but almost a year earlier, and was stable and ongoing. Moreover, it was revealed that in private conversations, David allegedly spoke about his marital problems and his desire to start life with a clean slate. Particular attention was paid to analyzing David's behavior on the day of the murder. According to testimony, he did not show the expected signs of shock or despair, and his behavior immediately after the police arrived was overly controlled. Behavioral analysis experts concluded that his emotional detachment and a number of speech patterns indicated a high degree of preparation and inner calculation. With strong evidence and a confirmed motive, the prosecution decided to press charges. In August 2016, 17 years after Belinda's murder, David Temple was arrested. At the time, he was still living in Houston and working in education, maintaining the appearance of a normal life. The arrest took place early in the morning at his home. Officers from the county sheriff's office presented a warrant and, meeting no resistance, took Temple into custody. According to an official statement, he was charged with first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances, taking into account the victim's pregnancy and the alleged staging of a robbery. The public, which had long lost hope for a resolution to the case, was shocked by the news. After the arrest, prosecutors issued a statement emphasizing that it was their duty to restore justice, even if it took a decade. Belinda's family, exhausted by years of waiting and inaction, finally had a chance to hear the official charges against the man they had believed to be guilty from the start. After years of uncertainty, slow investigations, and being forgotten in the archives, the Belinda Temple murder case finally made it to trial. In July 2019, 20 years after the tragedy, David Temple found himself in the courtroom, no longer a suspect, but charged with first-degree murder. The charges were extremely serious: the premeditated murder of his pregnant wife, staged to look like a robbery. It was a trial that was followed by the entire state of Texas, especially Harris County, where the tragedy had once taken place. The prosecution's case was based on three main components: motive, circumstantial evidence, and David's behavior after the crime. Prosecutors painted a compelling picture of a deteriorating marriage in which Belinda, according to her loved ones, felt increasingly isolated. At the same time, David was developing a romantic relationship with a colleague named Jennifer, a relationship that not only began long before Belinda's death, but also developed rapidly after her death. This fact was presented to the court as evidence that David was not only cheating, but also deliberately seeking to remove his wife from his life. Prosecutors argued that David had a motive. He wanted to be with Jennifer, but divorce was not an option for him. Belinda was 8 months pregnant, and the upcoming expenses associated with the birth of their second child only exacerbated the internal tension. He was a coach. A man with a public image, and a scandalous divorce from his pregnant wife could have damaged his career and reputation. Therefore, according to the prosecution, he took a more radical decision. A key element in the case is the attempt to stage a robbery. Investigators who reopened the case in 2016 concluded that everything in the house at the time of the murder seemed overly theatrical. The mess was unnatural, and there were no signs of a break-in or an attempt to escape through the back door. In addition, items that are usually targeted by burglars, wallets, electronics, jewelry, were left untouched. This convinced the jury that David's version of an accidental murder during a robbery did not stand up to scrutiny. Additional attention was paid to digital evidence. Thanks to the reconstruction of call histories, text messages, and analysis of cell phone GPS data, the prosecution was able to show that David's alibi on the day of the murder was not supported by technical data. At certain times, his location did not match his own testimony. This was compounded by testimony from neighbors, colleagues, and friends who described David's behavior on the day of his wife's death as unnaturally calm and controlled. The defense, on the other hand, insisted that all of the prosecution's arguments were circumstantial. They raised the issue of the statute of limitations, pointing to the silence of direct evidence. There were no fingerprints on the weapon. David's clothes did not contain traces of blood, and witnesses could have been mistaken after so many years. Lawyer Stanley Schneider repeatedly emphasized that the prosecution had succumbed to public pressure, which had been demanding punishment for years, and that the case had now been tailored to meet these expectations. He emphasized that Belinda and David's son, who was an adult at the time, continued to support his father and believed him to be innocent. Nevertheless, after hearing dozens of witnesses, experts, and analysts, the jury found that the prosecution had proven David Temple's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Two things in particular influenced them: the lack of logic in the robbery theory and the strong motive, which was accompanied by the defendant's rapid relationship with another woman. For many members of the jury, it became clear that the murder was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act. The trial lasted about a month, during which the courtroom was filled daily with the public, the press, and Belinda's relatives. Everyone was waiting for a resolution that would either close a 20-year wound or raise even more questions. The jury's decision was a turning point not only in the county's judicial practice, but also in the public's perception of justice, in cases where evidence had been hidden for decades. On August 14, 2019, the Harris County District Court found David Mark Temple guilty of the premeditated murder of his wife Belinda Temple and her unborn child. On April 12, 2023, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as well as a $10,000 0-cents fine. Belinda Lucas was born on October 11, 1968 in Dallas, Texas. She grew up in a traditional middle-class family that valued honesty, hard work, and family values. Her father, James Lucas, was an engineer and her mother, Sarah, was a homemaker. Belinda was the eldest of 3 children, and her family always had a supportive and loving atmosphere. From an early age, she showed a keen interest in learning and reading, and her parents were proud of her achievements at school. From childhood, Belinda was known for her kindness and open personality. She was an excellent student, an active participant in school activities, and also took part in volunteer projects. In high school, she became one of the leaders of the student council, organizing events and working with young people. Her school teachers often spoke of her as a talented and energetic person who could inspire others by her example. After graduating from high school, Belinda enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin, where she chose to major in education. She had always dreamed of becoming a teacher, and it was her sincere desire. At university, she was an active student, participating in various clubs and organizations, as well as volunteering in school programs for children with disabilities. Her professional ambitions were clear. She wanted to work with children, help them reach their potential, and be a mentor to them. Belinda graduated from university with honors and immediately began working as an elementary school teacher. Her career was going well. She was recognized as one of the best teachers at her school and was highly respected by her colleagues. Working with children, she always strove to create a warm and supportive atmosphere for them. Despite their young age, her students always remembered her as someone who had a significant impact on their development. Belinda's personal life was also fulfilling. She was in several relationships over the years, but true love came when she met David Temple. They met in 1995 at a school teachers meeting in Houston. David, a former American football and physical education coach, was a bright and confident man who immediately caught Belinda's attention. David was the kind of person who at first glance gave the impression of being successful and ambitious, and Belinda was no exception. She immediately felt that there was a special connection between them. They started talking, and after a few months, their relationship became more serious. David was charismatic, attractive, and very confident, which attracted Belinda. She found him an interesting conversationalist, and his athletic lifestyle, energy, and enthusiasm for his work won her over. After several months of dating, Belinda and David got married in 1996. Many of their friends and family were convinced that they were a couple who would be happy together. David and Belinda seemed like the perfect couple. Belinda with her calm nature and kindness, and David with his ambition and drive to succeed, were a harmonious match. The wedding was modest but very touching. Belinda even said that with David she felt completely fulfilled and happy. They started their life together in the suburbs of Houston, in a house that became their cozy family nest. There were many joyful moments in their marriage, but there were also periods when Belinda began to notice that her relationship with David was not as perfect as it seemed at first glance. They built a life together and had a son who became the center of their family world. Belinda devoted herself to raising her child, while David continued his career as a coach, working with children and teenagers. David was often busy at work, which caused some misunderstandings in their relationship. Belinda, despite her professional career, always considered her role in the family to be the most important. Like many couples, the spouses faced communication problems and everyday difficulties, but they remained close to each other. Their son was their pride and joy, and Belinda was ready to do anything to create the best conditions for his growth and development. January the 12th, 1999 began like any other day in Belinda Temple's life. She was preparing breakfast, getting ready for work, and planning to meet with colleagues and students. However, that day would be the last of her life. Belinda was 8 months pregnant, and her life was just beginning. She was expecting her second child, but fate had other plans. On the morning of that day, Belinda had no idea that her life would be cut short while she was home alone. What exactly happened that day was a question that had no clear answer in the first minutes after the tragedy. When David returned home and discovered his wife, he immediately called the police. He reported that his wife had been killed in a robbery. These words marked the beginning of a long investigation that would soon reveal the terrible truth about what had really happened. The Temple family home was located in a quiet residential neighborhood that had always been considered a safe place to live and raise children. It was a two-story house in a typical American style, with a small yard and garden. Outwardly, everything looked normal. There was a toy stroller in the yard and curtains hanging in the kitchen window, reminiscent of family comfort. But on that day, January 11th, the scene inside the house was far from cool. When the police arrived at the scene, they met David Temple, who said he had just returned home and discovered the horrific scene. He was calm, almost detached, when he reported that his wife had been killed in a robbery. However, his behavior raised questions for investigators. His excessive calmness and lack of shock or real distress immediately raised suspicions. But the police could not afford to jump to conclusions until they had examined the crime scene. When investigators entered the house, they immediately noticed that the scene did not match the typical picture of a robbery. The doors and windows of the house were intact, and there were no signs of damage or obvious signs that the robbers had tried to force their way into the house. However, there were several items scattered haphazardly on the floor in one of the rooms. The room where Belinda was found was located on the first floor. It was a cozy and bright corner with a small sofa, bookshelves, and decorations that evoked the warm atmosphere of home. Belinda's body was in the center of the room, on the floor, next to an armchair that she may have used to relax before doing her chores. Her position on the floor was strange, as if she had been trying to stand up but had fallen at some point. Belinda was dead, and the first thing that caught the eye was that she was dressed in her home clothes, as if she had not expected anything to happen to her. She had not been the victim of a violent struggle. The police found no signs of violence in the form of bruises or injuries, but the discovery of the body in such a position suggested that she may have been taken by surprise. There were traces of blood on her body, but no visible injuries that could indicate a violent attack. However, several strange details immediately caught the investigators' attention. First, there were no signs that the house had been ransacked, as is often the case in a robbery, with items scattered around the room. All valuables, including televisions, electronic devices, money, and jewelry, remained in place. It also seemed strange that the door to the house was open but had not been forced open. Usually in a robbery, the door is broken down, or at least an attempt is made to break in through the windows. However, nothing of the sort was found at the scene. Details related to the crime scene raised many questions. After examining the rooms, investigators began looking for clues that could give them an idea of what had actually happened. First of all, several strange elements caught their attention, indicating that the scene could have been staged. For example, bloodstains on the clothes and floor indicated that Belinda had most likely been shot at close range. Although her body was lying in a room where there appeared to be no signs of a struggle, the shot had been fired from close range. This meant that the perpetrator could have been someone close to her, and the shot was most likely unexpected. In addition, investigators noticed one important detail. The weapon that David claimed was used in the murder was found in the kitchen. It did not look like something a criminal would leave behind, especially if it was a robbery gone wrong. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, and David claimed that it did not belong to him but to the perpetrator. Another important point was that David claimed not to have heard the shot. His claims that he did not notice anything seemed implausible. There were no signs in the house that he had tried to check what had happened or contact his neighbors. The police also noted that the windows in the house were closed and the ventilation did not allow strangers to enter the house. This indicated that the criminal may have been familiar with the house and may have planned the crime in advance. In addition to the oddities at the crime scene, the neighbors' statements were also important. Some of them heard strange noises that sounded like an argument before they heard the police sirens. However, none of them could say for sure what had happened in the house. These statements only reinforced the suspicion that what had happened was something more than just a random robbery. In addition, investigators soon learned that Belinda had been in contact with several people on the day of the murder. She had arranged to meet a colleague after finishing her chores at home. Her last call was made about an hour before David reported the incident. Witness statements and phone records showed that she was in the process of planning her life after the birth of her second child, which created another mystery. Why kill her when she was in such a position? The house where the murder took place was located in a quiet, upscale neighborhood where such crimes did not usually occur. It was unusual for neighbors and local residents to hear about violence in the area, which only added to the shock and confusion. However, as the investigation continued, it became clear that this was far from a random crime. The evidence at the crime scene, the lack of obvious signs of a struggle, and David Temple's strange calmness raised many questions for investigators. After investigators examined the crime scene, they discovered several critical inconsistencies that did not match David's version of the robbery. First, there were no signs of forced entry or struggle in the house, which would be typical signs of a robbery. All valuables, televisions, money, jewelry remained in their places. In contrast, burglars usually leave a mess, scattering things around to grab everything of value quickly. This was not the case here, and the crime scene looked too organized to be the result of a robbery. With each passing day, it became increasingly clear that the robbery theory did not hold water. David, however, continued to insist that it was indeed a robbery and that the killer was a stranger. The investigators were forced to accept his testimony as their starting point. But they could not ignore the numerous contradictions. It was at this time that the first important clues began to emerge, which seemed unrelated to the case, but ultimately played a key role in changing the direction of the investigation. As soon as investigators began working with David's data and his circle, details of his personal life began to emerge, which later proved decisive. The investigation continued, and over the course of several months, investigators began to gather information about David Temple's personal life. Parallel to the murder investigation, details of his affair with another woman came to light. This information became a key factor, as it not only revealed a motive, but also showed that David may have wanted to get rid of his wife. After becoming part of Belinda and David's circle of friends and acquaintances, investigators began to hear stories that ultimately revealed the true nature of the couple's relationship. Even before Belinda's murder, there were rumors that their marriage was not going well. Belinda suspected her husband of infidelity, and this became a topic of conversation among their mutual acquaintances. According to investigators, these suspicions were well-founded, and it soon became known that David was indeed having an affair with another woman. At first, investigators were unable to fully confirm these rumors, but as they delved deeper into the case, new facts began to emerge. Secret correspondence, witnesses, and even photos on social media confirmed the existence of a long-term relationship between David and a woman named Jennifer, whom he had been dating before Belinda's murder. This discovery gave the investigation new momentum and allowed investigators to consider the real motive for the murder. David Temple was clearly deeply involved in a relationship with Jennifer, and this circumstance became an important element in the investigation. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the motive for the murder was not financial gain or an accident, but a desire to get rid of his wife in order to be with his mistress. However, despite all the suspicions and revelations about his personal life, investigators still did not have enough evidence to charge David Temple with murder when the trial began. Although there were clear contradictions in David's personal life and his affair with Jennifer had become public knowledge, this was not enough to bring the case to court. In 2004, when the investigation finally reached the trial stage, it was slowed down by a significant problem: the lack of hard evidence linking David directly to the murder. Despite all the evidence that had accumulated during the investigation, including the love affair and motive, the investigation failed to provide concrete physical evidence such as fingerprints, DNA, or eyewitness testimony. This circumstance played a key role in the case not going to trial. At that point, investigators could not prove that the murder had been premeditated, and there was no material evidence that could convince the court of David's guilt. Ultimately, the case was suspended and no charges were filed. Despite clear doubts about the veracity of David's testimony, the police were forced to leave the case in limbo. The prosecution was unable to gather enough compelling evidence to take the case to court, and it was closed indefinitely. This decision meant that none of the key elements of the investigation, including his romantic relationships and strange behavior, were deemed sufficient to bring charges. After the case failed to go to court, it was closed and sent to the archives. Over the course of several years, the investigation was discontinued, and all evidence, documents, and materials collected during the investigation were put away in boxes. The public and the media that had been following the case began to lose interest, and the tragedy of Belinda Temple faded into the background. With each passing year, as the case remained unsolved, fewer and fewer people were interested in its continuation. Belinda's family, who had suffered an irreparable loss, found themselves in a difficult situation, not knowing how to go on without answers to their questions about what had happened to their beloved relative. Meanwhile, David Temple's life continued as usual. He remained at work, and his relationship with Jennifer continued. All his actions were closely monitored by the public, but with each passing year, his life became less and less noticeable. He married Jennifer, and the world seemed peaceful, despite the dark secret that hung over him. The Belinda Temple case proved to be complex, confusing, and tragic for all involved. Despite numerous suspicions, a lack of evidence, and the inability to bring charges meant that the case was never properly concluded. Investigators were unable to bring it to trial, and it was closed. This was the tragic icing on the cake for Belinda's family, whose lives had been destroyed and justice left unfulfilled. Almost 2 decades have passed since Belinda Temple was found dead in her home in Katy. For almost as long, the case has been gathering dust in police archives, with no one daring to close it for good, but with nothing to move it forward. The lack of direct evidence, inconclusive clues, and most importantly, influential public pressure and the fine line between suspicion and accusation kept David Temple's name off the official list of suspects for years. However, in 2016, there was an unexpected and long-awaited turn in the case. The key catalyst for the reinvestigation was the initiative of a new team of prosecutors who came to power in Harris County. Among them was prosecutor Casey Garrett, who at the time was known for his attention to unsolved cases. When he studied the materials remaining in the Temple case, he was alarmed by many questions that had remained unanswered for many years. But it was not only an internal reassessment of the case that led to its reopening. Independent analysts and criminologists were brought in by the prosecutor's office as part of a program to review cases involving possible judicial errors and investigative shortcomings. They conducted a fresh analysis of the existing evidence using new technologies and methods that were not available in 1999. The main discovery was a more accurate comparison of time data, phone calls, movements, and phone activity, as well as witness statements. GPS systems, analysis of mobile device records, and more accurate time mapping allowed the team of investigators to identify contradictions in David Temple's alibi. He claimed to have been in a certain place at the time of his wife's death, but digital data showed that his car and phone were in a completely different area, closer to his home. In addition, investigators focused on thoroughly re-examining the facts already known. The motive was examined from a new angle. David's love affair, which had previously seemed a minor aspect, now took center stage. It turned out that by the time Belinda Temple died, David's relationship with Jennifer had begun not a few months before the tragedy, as he claimed, but almost a year earlier, and was stable and ongoing. Moreover, it was revealed that in private conversations, David allegedly spoke about his marital problems and his desire to start life with a clean slate. Particular attention was paid to analyzing David's behavior on the day of the murder. According to testimony, he did not show the expected signs of shock or despair, and his behavior immediately after the police arrived was overly controlled. Behavioral analysis experts concluded that his emotional detachment and a number of speech patterns indicated a high degree of preparation and inner calculation. With strong evidence and a confirmed motive, the prosecution decided to press charges. In August 2016, 17 years after Belinda's murder, David Temple was arrested. At the time, he was still living in Houston and working in education, maintaining the appearance of a normal life. The arrest took place early in the morning at his home. Officers from the county sheriff's office presented a warrant and, meeting no resistance, took Temple into custody. According to an official statement, he was charged with first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances, taking into account the victim's pregnancy and the alleged staging of a robbery. The public, which had long lost hope for a resolution to the case, was shocked by the news. After the arrest, prosecutors issued a statement emphasizing that it was their duty to restore justice, even if it took a decade. Belinda's family, exhausted by years of waiting and inaction, finally had a chance to hear the official charges against the man they had believed to be guilty from the start. After years of uncertainty, slow investigations, and being forgotten in the archives, the Belinda Temple murder case finally made it to trial. In July 2019, 20 years after the tragedy, David Temple found himself in the courtroom, no longer a suspect, but charged with first-degree murder. The charges were extremely serious: the premeditated murder of his pregnant wife, staged to look like a robbery. It was a trial that was followed by the entire state of Texas, especially Harris County, where the tragedy had once taken place. The prosecution's case was based on three main components: motive, circumstantial evidence, and David's behavior after the crime. Prosecutors painted a compelling picture of a deteriorating marriage in which Belinda, according to her loved ones, felt increasingly isolated. At the same time, David was developing a romantic relationship with a colleague named Jennifer, a relationship that not only began long before Belinda's death, but also developed rapidly after her death. This fact was presented to the court as evidence that David was not only cheating, but also deliberately seeking to remove his wife from his life. Prosecutors argued that David had a motive. He wanted to be with Jennifer, but divorce was not an option for him. Belinda was 8 months pregnant, and the upcoming expenses associated with the birth of their second child only exacerbated the internal tension. He was a coach. A man with a public image, and a scandalous divorce from his pregnant wife could have damaged his career and reputation. Therefore, according to the prosecution, he took a more radical decision. A key element in the case is the attempt to stage a robbery. Investigators who reopened the case in 2016 concluded that everything in the house at the time of the murder seemed overly theatrical. The mess was unnatural, and there were no signs of a break-in or an attempt to escape through the back door. In addition, items that are usually targeted by burglars, wallets, electronics, jewelry, were left untouched. This convinced the jury that David's version of an accidental murder during a robbery did not stand up to scrutiny. Additional attention was paid to digital evidence. Thanks to the reconstruction of call histories, text messages, and analysis of cell phone GPS data, the prosecution was able to show that David's alibi on the day of the murder was not supported by technical data. At certain times, his location did not match his own testimony. This was compounded by testimony from neighbors, colleagues, and friends who described David's behavior on the day of his wife's death as unnaturally calm and controlled. The defense, on the other hand, insisted that all of the prosecution's arguments were circumstantial. They raised the issue of the statute of limitations, pointing to the silence of direct evidence. There were no fingerprints on the weapon. David's clothes did not contain traces of blood, and witnesses could have been mistaken after so many years. Lawyer Stanley Schneider repeatedly emphasized that the prosecution had succumbed to public pressure, which had been demanding punishment for years, and that the case had now been tailored to meet these expectations. He emphasized that Belinda and David's son, who was an adult at the time, continued to support his father and believed him to be innocent. Nevertheless, after hearing dozens of witnesses, experts, and analysts, the jury found that the prosecution had proven David Temple's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Two things in particular influenced them: the lack of logic in the robbery theory and the strong motive, which was accompanied by the defendant's rapid relationship with another woman. For many members of the jury, it became clear that the murder was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act. The trial lasted about a month, during which the courtroom was filled daily with the public, the press, and Belinda's relatives. Everyone was waiting for a resolution that would either close a 20-year wound or raise even more questions. The jury's decision was a turning point not only in the county's judicial practice, but also in the public's perception of justice, in cases where evidence had been hidden for decades. On August 14, 2019, the Harris County District Court found David Mark Temple guilty of the premeditated murder of his wife, Belinda Temple, and her unborn child. On April 12, 2023, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as well as a $10,000 fine. Anna Maria Hanezevich was born on May 12, 1983, in Medellin, Colombia, one of the largest and most dynamically developing cities in the country. From childhood, she showed extraordinary curiosity and determination. Anna Maria was raised in a middle-class family where education was always a top priority, and her parents made sure she got the best education possible. From an early age, she showed an interest in foreign languages, studying English and French, and dreaming of one day pursuing a career in international communications and travel. Anna Maria's school years were marked by diligent study and active social activities. She was an excellent student, participated in school theater productions and sports competitions, and took part in volunteer initiatives. Her parents were proud of her achievements and encouraged every step in her development. Even then, the future woman was distinguished by her perseverance and strong character, which helped her overcome any difficulties. After graduating from school, Anna Maria enrolled at the University of Antioquia, where she chose the Faculty of International Communications. Studying came easily to her, and she quickly became one of the best students. At university, she did not limit herself to academic studies, but was actively involved in organizing cultural events, student exchanges, and social initiatives aimed at helping young people from disadvantaged families. Her dream of living outside Colombia became clearer, and she prepared for new steps on the path to her future. In the mid-2000s, Anna Maria decided to move to the United States, a country that attracted her with its opportunities and prospects. Shortly after emigrating, she obtained U.S. citizenship. There, she continued her education, successfully completing college with a degree in marketing and public relations. In her professional life, Anna Maria proved herself to be a talented and responsible employee. She got a job at a company specializing in real estate in Florida. In a short time, she earned the respect of her colleagues and clients thanks to her hard work, communication skills, and ability to find common ground with different people. A fateful meeting took place in Anna Maria's life in 2010 when she met David Kadzevich, a businessman from South Florida with Serbian roots, at a business event. They were immediately attracted to each other. Shared interests and similar views on business and life brought them closer together, and after a few years, their relationship went beyond business. In 2013, the couple officially tied the knot. The wedding took place in Miami in a warm and cozy atmosphere, surrounded by close friends and relatives, and it seemed that the newlyweds would build a bright future together. The first years of marriage were filled with success and joy. Anna Maria continued to develop her career, while David successfully expanded his real estate business. Together, they made plans for the future, dreaming of starting a family and working on joint projects. However, as happens with many couples, over time, small disagreements and misunderstandings began to arise between them. These disagreements were not dramatic, but gradually built up into a serious foundation for important decisions. By the end of 2023, Anna Maria and David had decided to separate and begin divorce proceedings. Despite their separation, they tried to maintain mutual respect and a cordial relationship, especially when it came to matters related to their shared property and business. This period was a turning point for Anna Maria. She decided to change her life, leave her familiar surroundings, and start over with a clean slate. So, in December 2023, she moved to Madrid, a city that had long attracted her with its culture, history, and opportunities. There, Ana Maria found a job at a small international company and continued to work in marketing, quickly adapting to her new surroundings and keeping in touch with her family and friends. Despite the recent changes in her personal life, many noted her calmness and confidence. Ana Maria was full of plans and striving for independence, believing in a bright future. She often shared her hopes and expectations with her loved ones, telling them about new projects and meetings. On that day, Ana Maria was at her apartment in a residential area of Madrid. It was a cold but clear Friday and she had no special plans. The day promised to be ordinary, a few business calls, meetings with friends, and running errands. In the morning, Ana Maria was chatting with her loved ones via Messenger, talking about her plans for the weekend and sharing her thoughts. However, by evening, her plans had changed dramatically. Ana Maria stopped answering calls and messages, which was unusual for her given her active and sociable nature. Friends and colleagues, accustomed to her friendliness and constant communication, began to feel alarmed. One of her close friends was the first to become concerned. She tried to contact Ana Maria and, receiving no response, decided to visit her in person. Unfortunately, the door to her apartment was locked, and attempts to call or summon help were unsuccessful. The next morning, her worried friends contacted Ana Maria's relatives. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the family decided to report her disappearance to the Madrid police. On February 3, 2024, the first official report of the young woman's disappearance was filed. The report described in detail the last days and circumstances surrounding her disappearance, emphasizing the suddenness and inexplicability of what had happened. Ana Maria's disappearance marked the beginning of a large-scale and complex investigation that soon attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies not only in Spain, but also in several other countries. The mystery of her disappearance remained unsolved, and questions about what had happened to the young woman continued to haunt both her family and the investigation. Thus began one of the most high-profile and tragic stories of recent years. A case that unfolded on an international scale, attracting the attention of various agencies and services. But at the moment when Ana Maria stopped communicating and disappeared from view, no one could have imagined that this day would be fateful for her, and that it would be followed by a chain of events that would shake not only her family and friends, but the whole world. On February 3, 2024, after the official announcement of Ana Maria Henao Knežević's disappearance, the Madrid police immediately began a search and investigation. The main task was to thoroughly search her apartment, the last place where the woman was seen alive. The apartment was located on the third floor of a modern residential building in one of the quiet residential areas of the Spanish capital. Law enforcement officers arrived at the scene and began a thorough search of the apartment, looking for even the slightest clues that could shed light on the circumstances of her disappearance. The door to the apartment was locked from the inside, which immediately raised questions among the police officers who arrived. Attempts to contact Ana Maria by phone and knocking on the door were unsuccessful. No one answered. Neighbors reported that they had not seen anyone leave or enter the apartment during the day, which only added to the alarm. Upon entering the premises, investigators immediately noted that the apartment was in perfect order, with no signs of forced entry or intrusion. Belongings were neatly arranged in their places, and there were no signs of a struggle, damage to furniture, or traces of blood. In the living room, there were several papers with unfinished notes on the desk, indicating that Ana Maria had been busy with something shortly before her disappearance. Next to the documents was a laptop, and the woman's mobile phone was also on the table and turned on. All this gave the impression that she intended to return soon and did not plan to be away for long. The investigators' attention was drawn to the bedroom. Here, the bed was neatly made, and a nightlight was burning on the bedside table, giving the room a soft glow. However, a broken cell phone lay on the floor near the bed. The screen was cracked and the case was covered with scratches. Despite the absence of obvious signs of violence in the room, this fact aroused suspicion, as it could indicate some kind of altercation or an attempt to contact someone at a critical moment. There were no signs of violence or struggle in the bathroom. There were traces of moisture on the floor indicating recent use of the shower or cleaning. There was a cup with tea leaves in the sink, as if the owner was preparing to relax after a long day. Overall, the apartment seemed lived in and cozy, with no obvious signs of panic or flight. The kitchen looked tidy, with a fresh receipt from the nearest supermarket on the table, dated February 1, the day before she disappeared. The food in the refrigerator and on the shelves was fresh, indicating that Ana Maria led a normal lifestyle and had no plans to go anywhere. At the same time, the kitchen window was slightly ajar, but it was too narrow to allow anyone to enter or exit, especially an adult. On the balcony of the apartment, investigators found scratches on the door and dirt stains on the floor next to it. These details raised questions among experts, as they could indicate either an attempted break-in or that someone had left the apartment through this exit. However, experts concluded that these traces were most likely accidental and did not constitute direct evidence of a crime. In parallel with the inspection of the apartment, the police began collecting video recordings from surveillance cameras located in the entrance of the building and on nearby streets. Particular attention was paid to shops and other public places in the vicinity. Investigators hoped that the cameras would capture suspicious individuals or vehicles that could be linked to Ana Maria's disappearance. This video footage became one of the key areas of focus in the investigation, as it could provide objective evidence and help trace the movements of suspects. While gathering evidence in the apartment, the police began questioning Ana Maria's relatives, friends, and colleagues. The interviews revealed that the woman had certain difficulties in her personal life. The tense situation with her ex-husband David Nazevich was particularly alarming. Witnesses reported that the couple was in the process of divorcing, which was accompanied not only by legal proceedings but also by emotional tension. Despite this, friends claimed that Ana Maria wanted to start a new life and leave the past behind. During questioning, it emerged that David Nazevich may have had motives to harm Ana Maria. However, at the time the investigation began, the police did not know where her ex-husband was. He had disappeared, and attempts to contact him were unsuccessful. This only complicated the case and reinforced suspicions that Ana Maria's disappearance was related to interpersonal conflict. Given the complexity and international nature of the case, Ana Maria's citizenship, Colombia and the U.S., and David's dual citizenship, the U.S. and Serbia, the investigation team prepared for a long and difficult process. To establish the truth, the police needed to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in several countries, analyze a large amount of information, and constantly exchange data. An initial inspection of the apartment showed that Ana Maria's disappearance was sudden and mysterious. The lack of signs of a break-in or struggle raised more questions than answers, and the broken phone and unfinished business suggested that the woman might have been trapped or subjected to violence. The police understood that a long and intense investigation lay ahead, one that would require not only professionalism but also patience. All the information gathered at this stage became the foundation for further searches, analysis of evidence, and identification of the perpetrators. The case gained significant attention both in Spain and abroad, attracting the attention of the public and international media. The investigators had a difficult task ahead of them, including interviewing witnesses, analyzing technical data, and cooperating with foreign agencies. Ana Maria's disappearance became one of the most confusing and dramatic stories of recent years, continuing to unfold without losing its relevance and leaving many questions unanswered. After a thorough search of Ana Maria in Alkanevich's apartment, the investigation team focused its efforts on gathering additional evidence that could shed light on the circumstances of her disappearance. A key area of focus was the examination of CCTV footage from cameras installed not only at the entrance to the apartment building where Ana Maria lived, but also on nearby streets and in shops located in the immediate vicinity. The police understood that these recordings could help identify who had visited the apartment in the period before her disappearance and what suspicious activities might have taken place. After starting to analyze the video footage, Investigators soon came across footage that became one of the main pieces of evidence in the case. The footage, from a camera installed at the entrance to the residential complex, showed a man dressed in dark clothing and wearing a motorcycle helmet. His movements were cautious and secretive. He seemed to be trying not to attract the attention of passers-by and camera. At one point, the man approached the security camera that was recording the movement at the entrance and began spraying paint from a can onto the lens. This action rendered the camera virtually useless, depriving investigators of the ability to obtain further images from that angle. About an hour after the camera was disabled, the man left the entrance carrying a medium-sized black suitcase. A comparison of these images with photographs and descriptions of the suspect, David Knežević, showed a high degree of similarity. Experts noted that the height, build, and manner of movement of the man in the helmet were almost identical to David's. This discovery was the first strong piece of evidence pointing to Anna Maria's ex-husband's involvement in her disappearance. Further investigation led the police to CCTV cameras installed in the vicinity of the apartment, including footage from nearby shops. In one of the hardware stores, the same man wearing a motorcycle helmet was recorded. He entered the premises and bought several items, duct tape, and a can of paint. Experts determined that these materials were used to damage the surveillance camera at the entrance. The payment was made in cash, which indicated an attempt to leave no electronic traces. The records confirmed that these purchases were made on the day of Anna Maria's disappearance, which gave these actions special significance and further linked the suspect to the scene of the crime. The investigators paid particular attention to mobile phone data. An analysis of David's cell phone showed that on the day of Anna Maria's disappearance, he accessed the internet and logged into Facebook while in Madrid. Cell phone operators confirmed that the phone was indeed functioning in Spain, which meant that David was nearby when his wife disappeared, not thousands of miles away. One of the key pieces of evidence was also the license plates stolen in Madrid. A few days before Anna Maria's disappearance, a series of car license plate thefts were reported in the city. During the investigation, it was discovered that a Peugeot car identical to the one rented by David with stolen license plates had been driving on Madrid's toll roads. Cameras recorded its movements, but the driver remained unseen because the windows were tinted. The car's exact routes matched the suspect's presumed movements during those critical days. This data helped trace the entire chain of events and plan further police action. Along with the technical evidence, the analysis of messages sent from Anna Maria's phone was also super important. On February 3, 2024, the day after her disappearance, several suspicious messages were sent from her number via a third party. The texts stated that Anna Maria had allegedly left voluntarily with an unknown man, which caused great confusion and alarm among her relatives and friends. They insisted that such words and actions were completely out of character for the woman. This fact was interpreted by investigators as an attempt to create a false alibi and mislead law enforcement agencies. A thorough analysis of all the evidence, video recordings, phone and car movements, and the content of suspicious messages, allowed investigators to piece together a complete picture of the suspect's actions. It was established that David Knežević had planned his movements in such a way as to conceal his involvement. He flew from Miami to Turkey and then immediately traveled to Serbia, where he rented a car. This car was later used to travel to Madrid. It was during this period that Anna Maria disappeared. In his attempts to establish an alibi, David claimed that he was in Serbia at the time of his wife's disappearance. However, evidence gathered by law enforcement agencies refuted this version. His phone activity in Madrid, video recordings, and data on the movements of the car with stolen license plates confirmed the opposite. The evidence gathered showed that the suspect had attempted to cover up the crime and used deception and false information to mislead the investigation. His actions demonstrated thoughtfulness and careful planning, which complicated the investigation. In the end, all the evidence and technical data were pieced together into a single logical chain. The investigation concluded that David Knežević was the key figure in the disappearance of Anna Maria. His motives, routes, and actions all pointed to his direct involvement. Now the law enforcement agencies were faced with the task of locating and arresting the suspect, who was already out of sight. The international nature of the case required coordination between police departments in different countries, as well as detailed analysis and information sharing. Only by joining forces were they able to get closer to solving one of the most mysterious cases of recent years. The months leading up to David Knezevich's arrest were filled with tense events that gradually brought the investigation closer to an important turning point. Careful examination of his movements, financial transactions, and connections allowed the police to piece together a detailed picture that ultimately led to the suspect's arrest. After Ana Maria's disappearance in February 2024, information about David's movements became a key element in the investigation. Analysis of mobile phone data, airline tickets, and video recordings showed that shortly after his wife's disappearance, he flew from Miami to Turkey and then traveled to Serbia, his country of origin. It was there, in the capital Belgrade, that he rented a Peugeot car. Investigators determined that the car had traveled about 4,800 miles, which was significantly more than usual. During its use, the car underwent noticeable changes. The windows were tinted, identification stickers were removed, and the license plate, which had previously been stolen in Madrid, was found to have been reinstalled, but with signs of tampering and repeated removal. The strange condition of the car and the manner in which it was operated became an additional cause for suspicion, as they gave the impression that the car was being used to hide or cover up traces of a crime. The police believed that these changes were related to an attempt to hide traces of travel, possibly the movement of a body or other evidence. In parallel with the investigation into his movements, investigators focused on Knezevich's financial activities. During January and February 2024, he carried out a series of real estate sales in South Florida. A total of 7 houses were sold, and the total value of the transactions exceeded $6 million. Particularly noteworthy were the large second mortgages that Knezevich provided to buyers. Prosecutors saw this as a possible motive, preparation to flee the country with a substantial amount of money that would allow him to evade justice. However, the suspect's lawyers insisted that he had virtually no liquid assets and that the sales were legitimate and not related to any crime. Despite these statements, the investigation continued to gather evidence, convinced that the financial transactions were part of a scheme to conceal property and funds. In May 2024, several months after Ana Maria's disappearance, David Knezevich was arrested at Miami International Airport immediately after arriving on a flight from Serbia. The arrest was carried out under heavy security with the participation of special forces and FBI agents. His detention was the result of coordinated efforts by several law enforcement agencies working together in an international operation. During his arrest, Knezevich behaved calmly and confidently. He did not resist, although he refused to admit any guilt. He handed over documents confirming his movements to the police and stated that he was willing to cooperate, but categorically rejected all accusations related to the disappearance and possible murder of his wife. After his arrest, the suspect was placed in a federal detention center in Miami where he remained without bail pending trial. Over the following months, his lawyers worked actively to gather evidence of his innocence and prepare a defense strategy. They argued that the investigation lacked direct evidence and that all the evidence was circumstantial and interpreted in a one-sided manner. The defense insisted that Knezevich was in Serbia at the time of Ana Maria's disappearance and that all attempts to charge him were based on assumptions and speculation. In addition, the lawyers claimed that their client had no motive for violence and that the divorce proceedings had been peaceful and without conflict. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued to gather evidence, collect testimony, conduct expert examinations, and deepen international cooperation. A number of new clues and pieces of evidence allowed the prosecution to expand the charges. In November 2024, David Knezevich was charged with additional counts of murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and domestic violence abroad. These new charges were a serious step toward bringing him to justice. The case was approaching trial, which promised to be one of the most high-profile and complex in the region. Public outcry and international interest only grew, while Ana Maria's family continued to hope for justice and the truth. During his time in the pre-trial detention center, Knežević repeatedly attempted to secure his release on bail, but the court, relying on the evidence gathered and the risk of flight, denied his request. Maintaining close contact with his lawyers, he continued to insist on his innocence and prepared for the upcoming trial. These months were a tense wait for the victim's family, law enforcement, and the accused himself. Everyone knew that the outcome of the case would have serious consequences, and every step could change the course of events. The case of Ana Maria Knežević's disappearance became one of the most complex and mysterious in modern criminal practice. Despite numerous efforts by investigators, a thorough examination of the evidence, and large-scale international cooperation, the young woman's whereabouts remained unknown. Even after the arrest and imprisonment of her ex-husband, David Knežević, hopes that she would be found alive gradually faded. There was no official proof of her death, but with each passing day, there was less and less evidence that Ana Maria could still be alive. The investigation faced a difficult task: to prove not only the fact of her disappearance, but also that a crime had been committed. The absence of a body and direct evidence of murder made it difficult to bring the case to court. Despite extensive circumstantial evidence and suspicions, investigators were unable to build a strong enough case to confirm the charges beyond reasonable doubt. Preparations for the trial were delayed, and public attention and pressure only added to the complexity of the situation. For many months after David Knežević's arrest, his lawyers actively exploited this gap in the evidence, insisting on their client's innocence and demanding his release on bail. However, the court, relying on an analysis of the threat to society and the risk of flight, repeatedly denied these requests, leaving Knežević in federal custody. Meanwhile, Ana Maria's family lived in constant tension and anticipation. They continued to hope for a miracle that their missing relative would return, but with each passing month they realized that this hope was becoming increasingly illusory. The women close to her actively participated in public initiatives, demanding justice and reminding the media of the tragedy. This story became a symbol of the fight against domestic violence and the need for more effective protection of vulnerable people. The trial was postponed due to a lack of conclusive evidence and complications related to the international nature of the case. Law enforcement agencies continued their work, but the lack of new substantial evidence hampered the progress of the case. In addition, David Knežević remained in isolation, going through a difficult time in prison, where the living conditions and psychological pressure took their toll on his state of mind. Then, in April 2025, there was an unexpected and tragic turn of events. David Knežević was found dead in his cell in a federal detention center in Miami. According to preliminary data, the cause of death was suicide. The circumstances of this event came as a shock to everyone involved in the case: the investigators, the lawyers, the family of the deceased, and the public. Knežević's lawyers expressed their deep regret and noted that their client's death left many questions unanswered. They stressed the importance of a thorough and transparent investigation into the circumstances of his death to rule out other possibilities. For Ana Maria's family, this news was another heavy blow. They were deprived of the opportunity to wait for the court's verdict and receive an answer that would have allowed them to close this tragic chapter in their lives. The death of the accused meant that justice remained unattainable and the story remained unfinished. This case will forever remain an example of how, even with advanced technology and international cooperation, it can be impossible to establish the whole truth. The mystery of Ana Maria's disappearance has never been fully solved, and the perpetrator has essentially escaped punishment. The situation left a feeling of deep uncertainty and loneliness, both for the victim's loved ones and for the investigators who put so much effort into this investigation. It is a reminder of the fragility of life and how difficult it can be to achieve justice in the most complicated and painful cases. Amanda Williams was born on May 15, 1977 in a small town near Cleveland, Ohio, She grew up in a close-knit family of 5, her mother, father, 2 younger brothers, and Amanda herself. Her parents always paid a lot of attention to their children, striving to provide stability and maintain close family ties. Even in school, Amanda stood out for her leadership qualities and determination. She was a role model for her peers, often helping her classmates and participating in community events. In addition, in high school, she became interested in art, particularly makeup and hair care, which gradually became her life's calling. After graduating from high school in 1995, Amanda enrolled at the Cleveland College of Arts and Crafts, where she earned a diploma in hairdressing. While studying, she worked actively in beauty salons to gain experience and support herself financially. It was at one of these salons that she was noticed for her professionalism and friendly attitude toward clients. After graduating in 1999, Amanda began working at one of the city's prestigious salons, where she quickly earned a reputation not only as a talented stylist, but also as someone who could be trusted. Over the years, she managed to build up a circle of regular clients, including young mothers, businesswomen, and students. People appreciated not only her skill, but also her sincere involvement, ability to listen and support. In addition, Amanda was actively involved in local charity events and was an active member of her church parish, where she was known as a responsive and caring person. Amanda's family life was no less eventful. In 2005, she met Tyrrell Edwards, who was then working as a manager at a Cleveland construction company. They met at a party and hit it off right away. Tyrrell was charming, attentive, and ready to support Amanda in all her endeavors. In the first months of their relationship, the couple tried to spend as much time together as possible, often meeting with friends and family, sharing their hobbies, and dreaming about the future. A few years later, in 2010, Tyrrell proposed to Amanda, and they officially became a couple, although the marriage was not legally registered until a year later. During their life together, they had 2 children, a daughter, Tyler, and a son, Tristan, who were the center of their universe. The family tried to spend their weekends together, went on walks together, and celebrated all important dates with relatives and loved ones. In the eyes of those around them, it was a strong and happy family where everyone supported each other. Amanda continued to develop as a professional, opening her own small beauty salon in 2018, which gradually gained popularity thanks to her reputation and high-quality services. At the same time, she remained an active member of the church and the local community, organizing master classes for young hairdressers and helping families in difficult life situations. In 2023, the situation escalated. Arguments became more frequent, accompanied by mutual recriminations and threats. Nevertheless, the couple did not publicize their problems, continuing to maintain the appearance of a happy family. Relatives tried not to interfere, hoping for the best, while Amanda tried to maintain balance by investing in her work and raising her children. October 9, 2023 began as a typical autumn day in the Williams family home. Quiet, with soft early morning light and cool air. However, this day was to become a tragic milestone in the lives of everyone who knew Amanda. In the evening, around 7:30 p.m., the police received a call reporting shots fired at the address where Amanda and Tyrrell lived. The alarm was taken very seriously. The call mentioned gunshots and possible violence inside the house. The police immediately dispatched several crews to the scene with priority response. Upon arrival, the officers expected to encounter a potentially dangerous situation requiring a quick and coordinated response. The officials who responded to the call prepared for any outcome, given the possible presence of firearms and the threat to the lives of those inside. The situation in the house soon became clear, but the events of that night forever changed the lives of the family and their loved ones. Upon entering the house, emergency responders immediately noticed that the interior had been ransacked. Items were scattered across the floor, and dark stains, presumably blood, were visible on the furniture and carpets. The air was thick with tension, as if a violent conflict had recently taken place in the house. In the living room, near the stairs to the second floor, they found Amanda Williams, a 46-year-old woman, lying unconscious with multiple gunshot wounds to her torso. The position of her body indicated that she had tried to dodge the attack or defend herself. Her personal belongings were scattered around her, and there was damaged furniture, indicating that a violent struggle had taken place in the house prior to the tragic incident. At that time, police officers found Amanda's husband, Tyrrell Edwards, in one of the rooms. He was detained at the scene without the use of force. Edwards appeared calm but was clearly tense and reserved. He was immediately taken to a separate room for initial questioning, as it was understood that his testimony would be one of the key elements of the case. During questioning, Edwards stated that he had fired in self-defense. According to him, during the argument, Amanda had grabbed a knife and threatened him, forcing him to use a firearm to protect his life. He insisted that he did not want to cause harm, but was only responding to an immediate threat. Investigators carefully recorded his words and asked follow-up questions in an effort to understand the details of what had happened. However, even at this stage, there were serious doubts about Edwards' version of events, both in terms of his testimony and in comparison with the evidence found. The crime scene was thoroughly examined in several stages. Investigators and forensic experts recorded all the details. A gun was found on the kitchen table and in various parts of the house, which was subsequently sent for ballistic analysis. This analysis was to determine whether the shots had actually been fired from this weapon, as well as to establish the distance and angle of the shots. A kitchen knife with the blade length of about 15 centimeters was found next to Amanda's body. The knife was thoroughly examined for traces of blood and fingerprints to determine whether it had been used in the conflict as a weapon of threat or attack. In addition, the condition of the house indicated that a struggle had taken place. Furniture had been overturned, there were bloodstains on the floor and walls, a lamp had been broken, and other items had been damaged. Investigators found several bullet casings scattered throughout different rooms, which helped to reconstruct the number of shots fired and their direction. In addition to physical evidence, the couple's phones were seized, as well as recordings from an external surveillance camera, which were to be carefully examined to identify possible details of the conflict and analyze the correspondence between Amanda and Tyrrell. All this evidence was sent to forensic laboratories for in-depth examination. Ballistic analysis, biological analysis, and chemical trace analysis became key stages in the investigation. Particular attention was paid to identifying discrepancies between the self-defense version and the actual data from the crime scene. For example, analyzing the angles of the bullet wounds and the distance from which the shots were fired could indicate whether Edwards was actually in danger. Despite the seriousness of the evidence found and the suspect's testimony, the prosecution decided not to press charges at this initial stage. The main reason was the lack of clear evidence of intent to kill. There were no obvious signs of deliberate injury, and further investigation was needed to clarify all the details. Thus, Edwards was released on condition that he cooperate with the investigation, although the case remained open and was closely monitored. The investigation was a difficult task for the police. On the one hand, they needed to thoroughly reconstruct the course of events and rule out any bias. On the other hand, they were faced with a lack of witnesses, aggressive parties, and the difficulty of confirming one of the versions. To achieve objectivity, the latest forensic techniques were used: multiple photographs, collection and analysis of fingerprints, examination of the distribution of bloodstains and shell casings, and verification of the integrity of the evidence. Every item at the scene was thoroughly analyzed to rule out misinterpretations. At the same time, investigators interviewed neighbors and relatives, collected witness statements, and analyzed camera footage and the couple's phone records to understand the nature of their relationship. Moments of emotional tension and conflict within the couple were identified, which added to the complexity of the case. All this required a special approach and attention to detail, as the fate of those involved in the tragedy depended on the correct interpretation of the fact. The release of the suspect, despite the seriousness of the incident, was a reflection of the thorough and balanced work of the prosecutor's office and the police, who sought to avoid hasty conclusions and mistakes in the classification of the crime. The situation required the collection of additional evidence, and comprehensive expert examinations to finally clarify the picture of that fateful evening. Thus, what at first glance appeared to be a simple call about shots fired at a house turned into a long and multifaceted criminal investigation and judicial process, where every clue found and every detail could play a decisive role. For the police and all those involved in the case, a difficult struggle for justice began, in which every piece of evidence and every testimony was of exceptional importance. The investigation into Amanda Williams' case progressed thanks to the comprehensive work of experts who carefully examined every detail of the incident. A key role in this process was played by the medical examination conducted by a forensic expert, whose analysis was an important step toward understanding what exactly happened on that fateful evening. The expert's conclusion had a significant impact on the course of the case, as it allowed for a more detailed examination of the events based on the fact. The medical examination revealed that the injuries sustained by Amanda had certain characteristics that did not fully correspond to the self-defense version of events given by her husband, Tyrell Edwards. The forensic medical expert drew attention to the direction of the bullets that entered the woman's body, as well as their location. This data did not rule out the possibility of a conflict, but it did allow the conclusion to be drawn that the circumstances may not have unfolded exactly as suggested in the initial version. At the same time, an examination of the knife found at the scene provided additional confirmation that Amanda was also involved in the conflict. The woman's fingerprints were found on the blade and handle, indicating that she had indeed been holding the knife at the time of the incident. This fact supported Edwards' claim that Amanda had threatened him, and thus pointed to the presence of elements of a conflict in which self-defense could have taken place. An important link in the chain of evidence was the forensic examination of the firearm. The gun that was seized at the scene was sent to a forensic laboratory, where experts confirmed that it was the weapon used to shoot Amanda. Tyrell Edwards' fingerprints were also found on the gun and related items. This evidence indicated that both items, the knife and the gun, were directly related to the conflict and were used in the tragic situation. Neighbors who knew Amanda and Tyrell confirmed that there had indeed been arguments and tense moments between the couple. Many noted that their relationship had not always been smooth, and at times they could have had conflicts, which added weight to the version of the conflict involving elements of self-defense. Although this testimony was not conclusive evidence of a crime, it nevertheless allowed investigators to consider both sides of the incident from a broader perspective. However, the most interesting and important element was the medical examination conducted on Tyrell Edwards himself. Despite all the destruction and signs of a struggle in the house, he was not found to have any injuries or damage. This circumstance gave reason to think about the role of each spouse in the conflict. The absence of physical injuries on Edwards suggested that Amanda was most likely the more active defender, which influenced the interpretation of what had happened. At the same time, experts and investigators understood that such conclusions required a cautious approach to avoid premature accusations. Taken together, all these facts indicated that the self-defense version could have some basis, but at the same time raised questions about its limits and the use of force. The investigation increasingly leaned toward the conclusion that Tyrell Edwards may have exceeded the necessary limits of self-defense and may have been a more active participant in the conflict than initially claimed. However, these conclusions were not final, and the investigation continued to carefully gather evidence and analyze all circumstances. As they continued their work, investigators paid particular attention to details that could shed light on the true motives and course of events. It was important to understand not only the fact that there was a conflict, but also the dynamics of the situation. Who initiated the aggression? What actions preceded the shots? And how the relationship between the spouses had changed at that moment. Investigators also carefully examined the applicability of legal norms on self-defense, seeking to understand whether Edwards' actions were within the limits permitted by law. The examination of electronic devices, correspondence, and CCTV footage helped to complete the picture. Messages and phone calls between the couple in the months leading up to the incident showed signs of tension, emotional pressure, and conflict. This data confirmed that the family relationship was in a difficult state, which could have been a precursor to the tragedy. However, none of the records allowed for an unequivocal conclusion about the intentions and real threat at the time of the incident. As a result of the work of experts and investigators, a comprehensive picture emerged in court. On the one hand, the use of both weapons, a knife and a gun, was confirmed, as well as the existence of a conflict and threats. On the other hand, there were no clear signs of intent in Edwards' actions, but there were grounds to believe that he had exceeded the limits of self-defense. This contradiction in the case file required a balanced approach in the further court proceedings. Thus, it was thanks to thorough examination and comprehensive analysis of the evidence that the investigation was able to track down the perpetrator, establish his involvement in the tragedy, and prepare the case for prosecution. These results allowed the case to move forward and ensure justice in a case involving complex human relationships, tragedy, and moral issues. After the tragic incident at the home of Amanda Williams and Tyrell Edwards, the investigation took a deeper turn when law enforcement officers seized the couple's cell phones. These devices became key sources of information, shedding light on the nature of their relationship and the dynamics of the events that preceded the fateful evening. Examining the contents of these phones allowed investigators to understand that family disagreements and tension within the couple were far from uncommon. The messages, correspondence, and calls exchanged between Amanda and Tyrell were fraught with conflict, emotional outbursts, and at times even threats, reflecting the complexity and difficulty of their relationship. As the analysis got more detailed, experts noticed that Edwards often came across as really aggressive and tense in these messages. This was a big contrast to how calm he seemed when he was first arrested at the scene. His tone and the content of his messages showed that he was prone to emotional outbursts and was not always able to control his behavior, especially in situations of conflict with his wife. It is important to note that the correspondence revealed not only Tyrell's aggressiveness, but also mutual tension between the couple. Amanda sometimes responded with harsh words and expressed dissatisfaction, indicating that the arguments in their family were mutual and deeply emotional. This information helped investigators piece together a more complete picture of the relationship, understand the motivation, and how tension had built up between the couple. This important insight allowed the incident to be viewed not as an isolated incident, but as the culmination of a long-standing conflict that unfortunately ended in tragedy. Information about the couple's tense relationship and the progress of the investigation became public. After the details of the incident and the preliminary findings of the police were made public, there was a significant public outcry surrounding the case. Local residents, activists, friends, and acquaintances of Amanda people demanded that the case be brought to justice as soon as possible and that the perpetrator be punished fairly. On social media and at public gatherings, there were calls for the authorities to pay more attention to domestic violence issues in order to prevent similar tragedies in the future. This public support and pressure became an important factor for law enforcement agencies, forcing them to prioritize the investigation, allocate additional resources, and speed up the process of gathering evidence. The case went from a local incident to a serious public issue that needed a quick and careful solution. After gathering and analyzing digital evidence, medical reports, witness statements, and other clues, investigators decided there was enough to press charges. In early November 2023, Tyrell Edwards was charged with murder and other related criminal offenses. An arrest warrant was issued at the same time. Contrary to expectations that the suspect might attempt to flee or resist arrest, Edwards took a different course of action. Upon learning of his impending arrest, he voluntarily went to the police station and turned himself in. This action demonstrated that he understood the seriousness of the situation and was willing to cooperate with law enforcement. Throughout the investigation, including the period between the first incident and the formal filing of charges, Edwards behaved calmly and rationally. Despite aggressive tones in his correspondence, he demonstrated restraint in real life and in his official contacts with law enforcement, which was noted by investigators and lawyers. His behavior was perceived as conscious and responsible, which to some extent mitigated the perception of his character in the eyes of the court and the public. However, None of these manifestations could change the fact of the tragedy or absolve him of responsibility for what happened. This stage of the investigation showed the importance of comprehensive and multifaceted methods of working with evidence. Not limiting itself to physical evidence, the investigation was able to extract information from digital sources that became decisive for the case. An analysis of telephone records revealed that the couple's family life was complicated, that tension and mistrust had been building up, and that the incident was probably not just a coincidence, but the culmination of internal conflicts. This knowledge helped not only in formulating the charges, but also in understanding the overall context in which the events unfolded. Public reaction also had an impact on the dynamics of the case. It highlighted the need for a systematic approach to domestic violence and support for victims. The activism of citizens and volunteer organizations helped raise public awareness and put pressure on official bodies, which accelerated the investigation and increased its transparency. Ultimately, this became an example of how civic engagement can influence the course of justice and help achieve fairness. Edward's voluntary surrender to the police was one of the key moments in his capture. This action demonstrated his willingness to accept the consequences and cooperate with the justice system, which did not go unnoticed either during the investigation or in the eyes of the public. At the same time, his calmness and level-headedness during interrogations and official proceedings helped to shape the image of a defendant who, despite his mistakes and misdeeds, was trying to behave with dignity. At this stage of the investigation, it became clear that there was sufficient evidence to refer the case to court. All the information gathered, from telephone records to medical reports, pointed to the complexity and multifaceted nature of the situation in which the accident occurred. The investigation, police, and prosecution prepared the necessary materials to ensure an objective review of the case and a fair verdict. Thus, thanks to the coordinated work of law enforcement agencies, expert services, and public support, the process of apprehending the suspect was carried out efficiently and without conflict. The case received widespread public attention, becoming a symbol of the fight against domestic violence and a call for attention to similar problems. At this stage, the story of Edwards and Williams moved into the next phase, the trial, where all the circumstances were to be objectively assessed and a fair decision rendered. The trial of Terrell Edwards was an important event in the judicial history of Cuyahoga County, and at the same time, a high-profile and emotionally charged trial that left neither the relatives nor the public indifferent. The case was heard in the district court, where an experienced and respected member of the judiciary was appointed as judge. The courtroom was packed with numerous participants in the proceedings: representatives of the prosecution and defense, members of Amanda Williams' family, witnesses, and residents of the city who had come to support the family of the deceased and expressed their protest against violence. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, as everyone understood the scale of the tragedy and its consequences, not only for the loved ones, but also for the entire community. The trial began with the careful selection of jurors, who were to listen carefully to all sides of the case and make an impartial decision based solely on the evidence presented and the law. The selection of the jury was carried out with particular care, given the sensitivity of the case and the need to ensure objectivity and impartiality. After the jury was announced, the court proceeded to hear the case. During the hearings, the prosecutors presented the case in a consistent and detailed manner. They emphasized key evidence obtained during the investigation, such as medical examinations, digital communications between the spouses, witness testimony, and forensic conclusions. Particular attention was paid to the conclusions of the forensic medical expert, who pointed to the nature of Amanda's injuries and the inconsistencies in the self-defense version presented by Terrell Edwards. Prosecutors explained in detail to the jury that, in their opinion, the defendant's actions went beyond necessary self-defense and had tragic consequences. They emphasized the emotional tension in the family, the quarrels, threats, and mutual conflicts evidenced by correspondence, and pointed out that Edwards may have acted with excessive cruelty. In their statements, the prosecution presented evidence confirming that Edwards was the initiator and active participant in the conflict, and that his actions exceeded the limits of permissible self-defense. This included reports from forensic experts on fingerprints found on the weapon, analysis of bullet casings and the angles at which the bullets entered the body, which provided insight into the sequence of shots and the nature of the confrontation. Testimony from neighbors who reported frequent arguments in the family supported the prosecutor's version. Experts were also heard in court explaining to the jury the legal nuances and norms related to self-defense, as well as the psychological profile of the defendant and the circumstances of his behavior. The defense attorneys focused on refuting the charges and emphasized that there were indeed complex emotional conflicts in the couple's relationship that could have escalated into a dangerous situation. They stressed that their client was acting under threat of death at the time of the incident, and that his actions were a response to a real danger posed by Amanda. The defense drew the jury's attention to the absence of physical injuries on Edwards, pointing out that this indicated his defense and attempts to avoid violence. In their statements, the defense attorneys asked the jury to consider all the circumstances in which the conflict developed and to assess the situation from the perspective of necessary action. They sought to elicit sympathy and understanding for their client, portraying him as a man who found himself in an extreme situation. Witnesses played an important role in the trial, including neighbors, friends, and acquaintances of the couple who shared their observations about the nature of the relationship, arguments, and attempts to resolve conflicts. Many of them spoke of repeated quarrels, tension in the family, and the couple's attempts to maintain the appearance of a normal relationship for the sake of their children. This testimony helped the court and the jury form a more comprehensive picture of the complex family dynamics. In addition, the court heard from experts who had conducted psychological and forensic examinations, which revealed the motivations of the parties and assessed the credibility of the versions presented. Their testimony allowed the jury to better understand the complexity of human relationships and how stress and conflict could escalate into a tragic outcome. The trial lasted several weeks, during which the parties took turns presenting their arguments, questioning witnesses and experts, while the judge closely monitored the proceedings and ensured that all procedural rules were followed. All participants understood the importance and responsibility of the upcoming decision. After the closing arguments, the judge gave the jury time to deliberate. The jury retired to deliberate, where they carefully analyzed all the evidence presented, the testimony heard, and the arguments of the parties. The decision-making process proved to be difficult and required deep reflection, given the contradictory nature of some of the circumstances and the need to reach an objective verdict in accordance with the law and justice. On March 11, 2024, the Cuyahoga County Court found Tyrell Edwards guilty on the following charges: 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and 1 count of domestic violence. The aggravated murder charge was dismissed. The court sentenced Tyrell Edwards to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 24 years. Ghulam Munda was born in 1951 to South Asian immigrants who settled in Pennsylvania in search of a better life. From childhood, Ghulam stood out for his diligence and perseverance, qualities that helped him achieve impressive success in his studies and career. He was the eldest of 3 children and helped his parents from an early age, working after school and on weekends. Ghulam's education was outstanding. He graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with honors and then went on to medical school, specializing in cardiology. His hard work and sincere desire to help people made him a respected doctor in the medical community of Western Pennsylvania. Many patients appreciated his attention and professionalism, and his colleagues respected him for his thoroughness and ethics in his work. In the early 1980s, Ghulam met Donna, a young woman from a neighboring town, who immediately won him over with her warm personality and sharp mind. Their acquaintance was almost fairy tale-like. At a party with mutual friends, a spark flew between them that turned into a strong bond over the years. They soon married and began building a life together. Ghulam and Donna's marriage lasted almost 20 years. During that time, they had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in an atmosphere of love and care. The family lived in a cozy house in the suburbs where relatives and friends often gathered. Despite Ghulam's busy schedule at the hospital, he always tried to find time for his family. On weekends, they went on picnics, celebrated holidays, and simply enjoyed each other's company. Like many families, the Moons had their difficulties. Sometimes there were disagreements, sometimes about work, sometimes about little things. Dana and Gulam did not always understand each other perfectly, and sometimes their discussions turned into arguments. But overall, they saw these moments as a natural part of family life, something that periodically arises and then subsides without leaving deep wounds. They both understood that family relationships require work and patience, and that love sometimes requires compromise. Dana took care of the household and raised the children, but she also found time for her hobbies, reading, gardening, and meeting with close friends. Despite his busy schedule as a doctor, Gulam tried to be a source of support for his wife and children. Their life flowed smoothly and seemed quite happy from the outside. The family's financial situation was stable. As a successful doctor, Gulam provided his family with everything they needed: a comfortable home, a quality education for their children, travel, and a comfortable lifestyle. They had savings and real estate, which gave them confidence in the future. The early morning of May 10, 2005 began as usual, calm, clear, and filled with the freshness of spring air. At around 5:30 a.m., Dana woke up earlier than usual to prepare breakfast and help the children get ready for school. Gulam, as usual, was already ready for his day at work, full of plans and tasks at the hospital. The house was filled with quiet bustle, the soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the muffled voices of children getting ready for school, and the alarm clock reminding everyone that a new day had begun. At 6 a.m., the streets in the suburbs were still half empty, and the city was just beginning to wake up from its night's sleep. At around 6:30 a.m., Gulam left his house, got into his car, and headed toward Ohio Turnpike to drive to the hospital. The road was deserted, typical for an early morning on a weekday. The weather was clear and the air was cool and fresh. At approximately 6:55 a.m., a dark car appeared on the empty stretch of road. No one knew who was behind the wheel or what the driver's motive was. A few minutes later, at around 7:00 a.m., a shot rang out, sharp and precise. The bullet hit its target, Dr. Gulam Munda, who was behind the wheel. The driver of the unknown car quickly left the scene, leaving behind silence and alarm. Only Dr. Gulam's car remained on the road with its wounded owner inside. Less than 10 minutes later, road workers were passing by. They noticed the car standing on the side of the road with the door open and saw the body inside. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, one of the workers immediately dialed 911 to report the incident. The workers waited for the ambulance and police to arrive. They remained at the scene, helping to ensure safety, directing arriving vehicles, and trying not to disturb the evidence before the investigators arrived. The incident on this deserted stretch of road shook the entire region. The early morning silence was shattered by a sudden act of violence, the perpetrator and motive of which were still unknown. The police arrived at the scene and began examining and cordoning off the area. Officers immediately marked the perimeter of the incident to prevent unauthorized access and preserve all evidence in its original state. The area on Ohio Turnpike where Dr. Gulam Munda's car was found had some distinctive features. It was a straight and relatively secluded stretch of road, surrounded by thick brush and woods on one side and open fields on the other. It was here, in this quiet and little visited place, that the tragic incident occurred. The police carefully recorded all the details of the scene. First, numerous photographs were taken from different angles: the position of the car, the condition of the doors, the distribution of shell casings on the roadside, and the marks on the ground. Experts documented every detail that could help in the further investigation. Particular attention was paid to the location of the vehicle. Dr. Munda's car was parked at the very edge of the road, the driver's door was ajar, and the body was inside. The position of the car on the road indicated a sudden stop, which is not typical for a normal trip on a highway. The bullet casings found at the scene shed light on the circumstances of the crime. 4 .38 caliber bullet casings were found in close proximity to each other. Ballistic analysis later confirmed that they had all been fired from the same weapon. Their exact location made it possible to determine the direction of the shots and the approximate position of the shooter. In addition, shoe prints were found at the scene that did not match those of the victim or the road workers who first discovered the body. These prints probably belonged to the perpetrator and provided investigators with an important lead. Their shape and size helped narrow down the search. A piece of fabric found on the branches of a bush near the scene was an equally important clue. The material and color matched the description of the clothing the suspect was wearing on the day of the murder, according to witness interviews and observations. Road workers who first discovered the body said that they had not noticed anything suspicious on that section of the road in the evening before the incident, but in the morning, they found a car with an open door and an unresponsive driver. They immediately called the police and an ambulance, which allowed the investigation to begin quickly and minimized the risk of evidence being damaged. Officers noted that the section of road had a limited number of possible approaches and escape routes, which helped them orient themselves in their search for the suspect. However, due to the remoteness of the location and the lack of CCTV cameras, the investigation was complicated by the absence of direct video evidence. In addition, experts noted the absence of signs of a struggle on the body and inside the car, indicating that the attack was sudden. The car had no visible damage, except for a bullet hole in the driver's door, which reinforced the theory of a carefully planned ambush. The police conducted a thorough search of the roadside and surrounding areas, looking for any items or traces that could be linked to the crime. Several cigarette butts were found, which were subsequently subjected to chemical analysis, as well as an empty drink bottle, possibly left behind by the suspect. Investigators also studied the route taken by the victim and recorded the details of his daily movements. Analysis showed that the perpetrator was likely familiar with the victim's schedule and habits, indicating prior preparation and planning. During the examination of the crime scene, experts noted that this particular section of the road was chosen because of its seclusion, which minimized the risk of accidental witnesses. In addition, there were no external light sources that could have helped the perpetrator escape in the dark after committing the crime. Special attention was paid to possible traces of the suspect's vehicle. Tire prints were found on the dirt shoulder that did not match the victim's car. This suggested that the perpetrator had arrived in another car, parked on the shoulder, and then quickly left the scene of the crime. Although the streets in this area were rarely patrolled, the police interviewed local residents and road service employees in an attempt to identify possible witnesses or individuals who had been seen nearby at the critical time. None of them had noticed anything suspicious, which made the investigation even more difficult. The overall picture gathered at the crime scene indicated that the perpetrator was highly skilled and cold-blooded. The police understood that in order to successfully solve the case, they would need to carefully compare the evidence and testimonies, as well as use modern forensic methods. The first few days after the incident were devoted to collecting and analyzing evidence from the crime scene. Every little detail, from fingerprints to scraps of fabric, could be crucial in finding the culprit. From that moment on, the investigators began the complex and multifaceted work of piecing together the complete picture of what had happened. After the tragic murder of Dr. Ghulam Munda, investigators immediately realized that the case would require maximum concentration and in-depth analysis. Initial suspicions were based on a thorough examination of the crime scene and the evidence collected. The police knew that this was not a random crime, but a carefully planned act. The victim's car was parked on the side of the road. The driver's door was ajar, and inside lay a body with no signs of a struggle. Everything pointed to a sudden attack. These details suggested to investigators that the perpetrator was familiar with the doctor's daily routine and took advantage of a moment when he was at his most vulnerable. However, despite the obviousness of the initial assumptions, the path to solving the case proved to be difficult and multifaceted. An important breakthrough came when investigators gained access to the cell phone of Donna Munda, the victim's wife. It was there that they found the information that led them to the suspect. Donna's correspondence with Damien Bradford, which was extracted from the phone, proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. The messages contained not just personal confessions and romantic phrases, they revealed collusion and planning of the crime. In the texts, Donna affectionately called Bradford Daddy, and he responded to her as little girl. In addition to intimate language, the correspondence included discussions of details that pointed to preparations for the murder. They exchanged information about the time and place, discussed methods and consequences, which clearly linked them to the crime. The police analyzed the timestamps of the messages in detail and found that the active communication between Donna and Bradford took place in the period immediately preceding the tragedy. This data became one of the cornerstones of the investigation. The existence of correspondence with such content allowed investigators to focus their attention on these two as the main suspects. This was followed by interviews with relatives, friends, and colleagues of the victim and his wife. Witnesses said that the Munda family, like any other, had its ups and downs. Donna and Golem, according to them, were experiencing normal family difficulties, disagreements, unresolved issues, temporary quarrels. However, none of their loved ones could have imagined that something much darker was developing between them. People noted that Donna was quite secretive, rarely sharing her thoughts and plans, and her affair with Bradford remained a secret to those around her for a long time. The name Damien Bradford first came up in phone records and witness statements. Bradford was a man with a criminal past who lived near the Moons family and had already been convicted of violent crimes. This information made him the main figure in the investigation. Investigators carefully examined all his contacts and connections, revealing a close relationship with Donna, who had not previously attracted the attention of the police. Technical expertise became a key link in the chain of evidence. DNA analysis conducted on fabric fragments found at the crime scene matched samples from Bradford. These traces could not be dismissed as coincidental. They were clear evidence of his physical presence. Ballistics confirmed that all the shell casings found at the scene had been fired from the gun that was later seized from Bradford. This combination of the weapon and the evidence significantly strengthened the investigation's case. An important element was the examination of the suspect's phone records. An analysis of calls and messages allowed investigators to reconstruct their routes and times of travel. Bradford appeared repeatedly in the area where the murder took place, and he and Donna were in constant contact discussing plans and details. This evidence pointed not to a chance encounter but to a deliberate and premeditated conspiracy. The motive for the crime also played a significant role. The investigation revealed that Donna was seeking access to a large inheritance that was to pass to her and her children after Gulamunda's death. The estate was estimated to be worth millions of dollars and included real estate and large cash deposits. Donna was in a difficult financial situation and in a relationship with Bradford, who, having no stable income, was interested in financial support. Correspondence showed that Donna had promised Bradford a significant share of the property in exchange for carrying out the plan. Interrogations of the suspects revealed interesting details. Donna initially refused to admit her guilt, trying to deny any criminal intent. However, under the weight of the evidence and witness testimony, her position weakened. Bradford confessed to directly participating in the murder, but claimed that he was acting on Donna's orders. Their statements ultimately coincided, confirming their collusion and mutual interest. The investigation also analyzed the suspect's movements and communications in the days leading up to the crime. This allowed investigators to reconstruct a detailed timeline. Donna and Bradford actively coordinated their actions, choosing a time and place that was convenient and, in their view, as safe as possible for carrying out their plan. The investigation was fraught with difficulties. The lack of direct witnesses, video recordings, and some key pieces of evidence made the task much more difficult. However, thanks to the coordinated work of forensic experts, careful examination of digital traces, and thorough collection of testimony, it was possible to piece together a complete picture. Modern methods of DNA analysis, ballistics, and forensic expertise played an important role. The police also faced attempts by the suspects to cover their tracks. Attempts to hide or destroy correspondence and messages were discovered, but digital traces remained. Analysis of data on servers and in cloud storage helped to recover deleted files and prove the connection. The operation to arrest Donna Munda and Damien Bradford was a key step in solving the murder of Dr. Ghulam Munda. After months of gathering evidence, analyzing correspondence, phone data, and technical expertise, law enforcement had enough to take action. Donna was arrested in July 2006, more than a year after the tragedy. On that day, FBI agents arrived at her home in Hermitage, Mercer County. Donna greeted them with visible distress. Surprise and shock were evident on her face, but she tried to remain calm. Police officers presented her with an arrest warrant and explained the charges against her, after which she was taken to the station for further processing. Damien Bradford was arrested at the same time as Donna in the area where he lived. His arrest was conducted under heavy surveillance, given his criminal history and the potential danger he might pose. At the time of his arrest, Bradford remained defiant but did not attempt to resist. He understood the seriousness of the situation and probably anticipated the inevitability of his arrest. After the arrest of Donna Munda and Damien Bradford, the investigation moved into a phase of intensive questioning, which became a key stage in the investigation. Both suspects were isolated and taken in for questioning one at a time, where they were given the opportunity to present their version of events. From the very beginning of the interrogation, Bradford showed a willingness to cooperate. He admitted his involvement in the murder of Dr. Munda, giving a detailed account of his participation. Bradford described how and when the attack was planned, what precautions were taken, and how he fired the shots. His testimony matched the evidence and testimony gathered, which significantly strengthened its credibility. However, the most important and dramatic moment of the interrogation was Bradford's admission that after receiving the agreed amount of money, he had not initially planned to stay with Donna Munda. He openly stated that he intended to break off the relationship and leave, starting a new life apart from her. This confession shocked not only the investigators, but also Donna herself, who was present during the interrogation either in the next room or in the same room under observation. When Bradford's words about his intention to leave Donna after committing the crime reached her, her emotional state deteriorated sharply. She began to cry, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. It was obvious that these words had shaken her to the core. One couldn't help but feel that for Donna, this confession was not only confirmation of betrayal, but also a painful blow to the hopes and feelings she had harbored for Bradford. Her tears and inner turmoil became one of the most vivid and memorable episodes of the interrogation. At that moment, the human side of the tragedy was revealed. Behind the criminal plan and the murder were feelings, deception, and betrayal. This became important psychological evidence, highlighting the complexity and multifaceted nature of what had happened. For investigators, this moment was not only emotional but also informative. Bradford's confession helped to better understand the dynamics of the relationship between the suspects, their motivation, and the details of the plan. It also strengthened the evidence base, confirming that the murder was carefully planned and carried out as part of a conspiracy. Bradford's testimony confirmed many details known to the investigation. He described the location and time of the attack, how Dr. Munda's car was stopped, and the circumstances surrounding the shots. This information matched the evidence found, which strengthened the credibility of his statements. One of the key pieces of evidence found on Damien Bradford was his personal car, which was seized during a search after his arrest. This car attracted the attention of investigators immediately after it was examined. Experts noted that the tires on this car matched the tire prints found at the crime scene. It was these prints on the dirt shoulder near the spot where Dr. Ghulam Munda was shot that initially became one of the important clues for forensic experts. During a detailed examination of the car, experts conducted a comparative analysis of the tire treads. The prints taken from the crime scene had unique characteristics, tread depth, shape, and wear that were virtually impossible to reproduce on another car by accident. A comparison with the tires of Bradford's car showed that all these parameters matched perfectly. This meant that it was this car that the perpetrator used to drive to the crime scene and then quickly leave it. The very fact that this particular car was found and its connection to the crime scene confirmed significantly strengthened the case against Bradford. This evidence became one of the central pieces in the case, as it not only confirmed his presence at the right time and place, but also showed that the suspect's actions had been planned and coordinated in advance. In addition, a gun was seized from Bradford, which was later subjected to ballistic analysis. Experts confirmed that this was the weapon used to kill Dr. Munda. The bullets recovered at the scene matched the shots fired from this gun. This was further irrefutable evidence of Bradford's involvement in the crime. The arrest of Donna and Bradford came as a shock and bewilderment to their relatives and loved ones. For many, it came as a complete surprise. No one could imagine that Donna, who seemed like a quiet, family-oriented woman, could be involved in such a horrific crime. Relatives struggled to accept the accusations, expressing doubts and grief. They tried to find explanations and understand what could have led to such an outcome. During the investigation, close family members testified that there were no signs of such a crime in their circle, and that only Donna and Bradford, whose relationship had been secret for a long time, had behaved suspiciously. These testimonies were important in forming a complete picture of the case. After all investigative measures were completed, Donna Moon and Damian Bradford were officially charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The charges also included planning and executing the crime for financial gain. From that point on, the case moved to the trial stage. The entire story of the arrests and charges caused a widespread public outcry and media coverage. County residents and acquaintances of the family watched the developments with surprise and concern, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. The trial was expected to be one of the most high-profile cases in the region. After months of thorough investigation and the filing of official charges against Donna Munda and Damian Bradford, the case was transferred to the federal court in Mercer County. The trial immediately attracted public and media attention, becoming one of the most high-profile and controversial cases in the region's history. The trial went beyond a typical criminal case, as it involved not only murder but also family betrayal, secret conspiracies, and a significant financial motive, which caused widespread public outrage. The role of the lawyers and the defense of the accused proved to be crucial in the trial. Donna Munda and Damian Bradford received skilled legal support. Each was represented by experienced criminal law specialists who made every effort to defend their clients. The lawyers carefully analyzed all the evidence presented by the prosecution, seeking to identify gaps and contradictions. The main weapon of the defense was an attempt to mitigate the guilt of the defendants and cast doubt on the nature of their involvement in the crime. Donna Moon's defense focused primarily on presenting her as a victim of circumstances rather than an active organizer. The lawyers tried to prove that the evidence against her was circumstantial and that her correspondence with Bradford could have been taken out of context or misinterpreted. They also pointed out that Donna had no direct physical involvement in the crime and attempted to discredit key witness testimony, particularly Bradford's own confession, suggesting that he may have lied to protect himself. Damian Bradford's defense attorneys, in turn, focused the jury's attention on their client's complex and ambiguous past. They emphasized his psychological state and motives, eliciting sympathy from the audience and attempting to explain his actions as the result of pressure and manipulation by Donna Munda. Bradford was portrayed as a performer who had been trapped by circumstances. The trial began in early 2007 in federal court in Mercer County. The courtroom was packed with jurors, prosecutors, lawyers for both sides, defendants, witnesses, and numerous media representatives. The atmosphere was tense, as not only the fate of two individuals was at stake, but also the principle of justice. Prosecutors prepared a powerful indictment based on extensive evidence. This included a detailed analysis of correspondence between Donna Munda and Damian Bradford, which contained discussions about murder plans, the distribution of inheritance, and details of the crime. DNA test results confirming Bradford's physical presence at the scene were also presented, as well as ballistics tests linking the weapon used to fire the shot to Bradford himself. In addition, The court heard testimony from witnesses, including police officers, forensic experts, relatives, and acquaintances of the defendants. This testimony helped to piece together a picture of the events, confirm technical details, and reveal the suspect's motives. Of particular significance were Bradford's confessions, in which he described in detail how he carried out the murder, as well as his relationship with Donna, her role in organizing the crime, and his own plans for the future. The prosecution emphasized that Donna Munda was not a passive participant. On the contrary, the prosecution portrayed her as the initiator and main coordinator of the conspiracy. According to the prosecution, she carefully planned her husband's murder, hoping to gain significant financial benefit. Bradford acted as the perpetrator who, despite his personal intention to leave Donna after the crime, was well aware of the seriousness and consequences of his actions. In response, the defense attempted to break down the charge into its constituent parts, emphasizing the lack of direct evidence of Donna's physical involvement in the crime, questioning Bradford's motives, and focusing on the unreliability of some of the evidence and witnesses. The lawyers tried to show that the case contained a lot of circumstantial evidence and therefore could not serve as the basis for a harsh sentence. The trial proceeded with intense hearings over several months. The parties carefully examined every detail, conducted cross-examinations, and presented and refuted evidence. The jury closely followed the proceedings, analyzed the arguments and contradictions, and weighed the facts and testimony. On November 15, 2007, the Mercer County Federal Court found Donna Munda guilty of conspiracy to murder and the murder of her husband, Dr. Ghulam Munda. On the same day, the court sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On November 15, 2007, the federal court in Mercer County found Damian Bradford guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Bradford was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison.